On the night of June 17th, 1239, within the stone walls of Westminster Palace, Queen Eleanor of Provence gave birth to her first son. The child who would become Edward the entered the world during one of the most turbulent periods of medieval English history, as his father Henry III struggled against mounting baronial opposition and financial crisis. The infant prince was named Edward, likely in honour of Edward the Confessor, the last Anglo-Saxon king whose cult Henry III had enthusiastically promoted as part of his efforts to legitimise Plantagenet rule, through connection to England's pre-Norman past. The Westminster Palace of Edward's birth bore little resemblance to the modest royal residence of earlier centuries. Henry III had transformed it into a magnificent Gothic complex, complete with painted chambers, elaborate wall hangings, and the stunning painted chamber where the young prince likely spent his earliest years. The palace buzzed with the constant activity of royal administration as clerks, courtiers, and petitioners moved through its corridors. This environment of ceremonial grandeur and administrative complexity would profoundly shape Edward's understanding of kingship from his earliest consciousness. Edward's Norman Plantagenet heritage represented a convergence of two of Europe's most dynamic ruling traditions. Through his father, he descended from the Norman conquerors who had reshaped England after 1066, inheriting their talent for military organisation and administrative innovation. The Plantagenet line, established by his great-great-grandfather Henry II, had created an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, though much of this continental dominion had been lost during the reigns of John and Henry III. From his mother, Eleanor of Provence, Edward inherited connections to the sophisticated court culture of southern France, where troubadour poetry and chivalric ideals flourished alongside political intrigue. The political landscape of Edward's childhood was dominated by the mounting tensions between Henry III and his barons. The king's expensive foreign adventures, particularly his futile attempts to recover lost Plantagenet territories in France and his costly support for papal campaigns in Sicily, had drained the royal treasury and provoked widespread resentment among the English nobility. Henry's reliance on foreign advisers, many of them relatives of Queen Eleanor, further antagonised native-born lords who felt excluded from royal favour and profitable offices. By the time Edward reached his 5th birthday in 1244, these tensions had crystallised around specific grievances. The barons complained bitterly about Henry's arbitrary taxation, his disregard for traditional consultative procedures, and his apparent preference for continental over English interests. The young prince would have observed the increasingly strained atmosphere at court, where his father's attempts at magnificent display could not disguise the underlying financial and political instability of the regime. Edward's formal education began around 1246, under the supervision of Peter of Aigueblanche, Bishop of Hereford, a Savoyard cleric who had risen to prominence through Queen Eleanor's influence. Peter represented the cosmopolitan continental orientation that characterised much of Henry III's court. Under his tutelage, Edward received instruction in Latin literature, canon law, and the principles of Christian kingship. The curriculum emphasised the divine nature of royal authority, while also exposing the young prince to the intellectual traditions of medieval scholasticism. The choice of Peter of Aigueblanche as Edward's principal tutor reflected Henry III's determination to provide his heir with an education befitting a European prince rather than merely an English king. Peter had studied at the University of Paris and maintained extensive contacts with continental scholars and churchmen. Through him, Edward gained exposure to the latest developments in legal theory, particularly the revival of Roman law that was transforming European concepts of sovereignty and governmental authority. Military training formed an equally crucial component of Edward's education. The young prince learned swordsmanship, horsemanship, and the use of various weapons under the guidance of experienced knights who had served in Henry III's continental campaigns. These instructors brought first-hand knowledge of evolving military tactics, particularly the increasingly sophisticated use of cavalry charges and the coordination of different types of troops in battle formations. Edward's exposure to continental warfare tactics came not merely through theoretical instruction, but through direct observation of the military preparations and the accounts of returning veterans. The castle yards of Westminster and other royal residences regularly hosted training exercises where young nobles practiced the complex manoeuvres required for effective cavalry warfare. The prince learned to handle destriers, the massive war horses bred specifically for battle, and to coordinate his movements with other mounted warriors in formation charges. The chivalric ideals that permeated Edward's military education emphasized honor, loyalty, and prowess in combat as the defining characteristics of noble masculinity. These concepts, originally developed in the courts of northern France, had been refined and romanticized through the literature of courtly romance that flourished in Eleanor of Provence's circle. Edward absorbed these ideals not as abstract principles, but as practical guidelines for conduct that would shape his approach to warfare and diplomacy throughout his life. The outbreak of the Second Barons' War in 1258 thrust the 19-year-old Edward into the centre of English political crisis. The conflict began when a group of barons, led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, forced Henry III to accept the provisions of Oxford, a comprehensive reform programme that established baronial control over royal administration and finances. Initially, Edward found himself aligned with the reformist cause, partly through genuine sympathy for baronial grievances and partly through the influence of his close relationship with Simon de Montfort. Simon de Montfort presented a fascinating and complex figure who would profoundly influence Edward's political development. Born in France but holding the English earldom of Leicester through his marriage to Henry III's sister Eleanor, Simon embodied the cosmopolitan nobility that characterized 13th century Europe. He possessed exceptional military skills, demonstrated during his brutal suppression of the Albigensian heresy in southern France, combined with genuine religious piety and a sophisticated understanding of legal and constitutional principles. Edward's initial support for the baronial cause reflected both personal loyalty to Simon de Montfort and his own frustration with his father's ineffective governance. The young prince had witnessed firsthand the consequences of Henry III's financial mismanagement and diplomatic failures. The reform programme promised more efficient administration, regular consultation between crown and nobility, and an end to the favouritism shown to foreign courtiers. However, Edward's allegiance to the baronial cause proved temporary and ultimately strategic rather than ideological. As the reform movement evolved into outright rebellion, the prince began to recognise the threat it posed to royal prerogatives that he would eventually inherit. The provisions of Oxford, while addressing legitimate grievances, also established precedents for baronial control over royal policy that could permanently weaken monarchical authority. The decisive moment in Edward's political evolution came in 1264, following his dramatic escape from baronial custody at Hereford. After being held as a hostage to guarantee his father's compliance with reform demands, Edward managed to flee during a hunting expedition, demonstrating both the physical courage and tactical cunning that would characterize his later military campaigns. His escape involved a carefully planned deception where he exhausted his guards' horses through an extended mock hunt before spurring his own fresh mount to freedom. Edward's switch of allegiances transformed the dynamics of the Second Barons' War. His military talents, combined with his legitimate claim to represent royal authority, provided the royalist cause with a charismatic leader capable of matching Simon de Montfort's reputation for military prowess. The prince's defection also signalled to wavering nobles that the reform movement had overreached, encouraging former supporters to reconsider their positions. The marriage of Edward to Eleanor of Castile in 1254 had been arranged as part of Henry III's broader diplomatic strategy to strengthen English influence in southwestern Europe. Eleanor was the daughter of Ferdinand III of Castile and the half-sister of Alfonso V, who would later claim the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The match represented a significant departure from traditional English marriage alliances, which had typically focused on French or Low Countries nobility. Eleanor brought to the marriage not only her Castilian heritage, but also substantial territorial claims in Gascony, the last major Plantagenet possession in southwestern France. These lands provided both strategic depth for English continental interests and valuable sources of revenue, particularly from the wine trade that connected Gascon vineyards to English markets. The marriage thus served immediate economic interests, while also positioning England as a potential player in Iberian politics. The political implications of the Castilian alliance extended far beyond immediate territorial considerations. Alfonso X's imperial ambitions and his conflicts with French expansion in the Mediterranean created opportunities for English diplomatic intervention in European affairs. Edward's marriage established family connections that could be activated to support English interests against French hegemony or papal political schemes. Eleanor herself proved to be far more than a diplomatic pawn. Contemporary accounts describe her as intelligent, cultured, and politically astute, with a particular interest in literature and architectural patronage. She brought to the English court connections with the sophisticated intellectual life of 13th century Castile, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars collaborated in translating and preserving classical texts. Her influence would later be reflected in Edward's own patronage of learning and his relatively tolerant approach to intellectual diversity. The couple's early married life was spent primarily in Gascony, where Edward gained practical experience in territorial administration and cross-cultural diplomacy. The duchy's population included not only French-speaking Christians, but also significant Jewish communities and Muslim minorities, requiring governing approaches that balance competing interests and traditions. This experience proved invaluable preparation for Edward's later rule over the diverse populations of Britain and Ireland. During his years in Gascony, Edward also encountered the military challenges that would define much of his later reign. The duchy's borders with French royal territory remained contested, requiring constant vigilance against encroachment and occasional military action to defend English claims. These frontier conflicts provided Edward with practical experience in siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and the logistical challenges of maintaining armies in hostile territory. The administrative responsibilities of a governing Gascony exposed Edward to the complexities of medieval government beyond the ceremonial aspects he had observed at his father's court. He learned to balance the competing demands of local nobles, urban merchants, and rural peasants while maintaining the flow of revenues to England. This experience taught him the practical limitations of royal authority and the importance of maintaining local support through careful attention to regional interests and traditions. The experience Edward gained in Gascony proved instrumental in shaping his approach to the monumental undertaking that would define the early 1270s. By 1268, reports from the Holy Land painted an increasingly desperate picture of Christian fortunes in the Levant. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars had systematically captured Crusader strongholds throughout Syria and Palestine, reducing the once mighty Crusader states to a handful of coastal enclaves. Antioch fell in 1268, its population slaughtered or enslaved, while Acre remained the last major Christian stronghold of any significance. These disasters reverberated throughout Christian Europe, prompting calls for a new crusade to preserve what remained of 2 centuries of Latin presence in the East. Edward's decision to take the cross emerged from a complex interplay of personal conviction, political calculation, and dynastic ambition. The crusading ideal remained powerful among the European nobility, representing the highest expression of Christian knighthood and offering opportunities for both spiritual salvation and worldly glory. For a prince who had spent his formative years absorbing chivalric literature and participating in tournaments that celebrated martial prowess, the call to defend the Holy Land resonated deeply with his conception of noble duty. The timing of Edward's crusading vow also reflected shrewd political judgment. England had emerged from the Second Barons' War with royal authority restored but not yet fully consolidated. A successful crusade would enhance Edward's reputation throughout Europe while removing him from domestic politics during a period when his father needed space to rebuild royal finances and administrative control. The prince's absence would also prevent any perception that he was impatiently awaiting his inheritance or interfering with Henry III's efforts to restore stable government. Louis IX of France had announced his intention to launch what would become known as the Eighth Crusade in March 1267, providing Edward with an opportunity to participate in a major international expedition under the leadership of Europe's most respected Christian monarch. Louis's reputation for personal sanctity and military competence promised to attract significant noble participation from across Western Europe, creating the kind of large-scale effort that might actually achieve meaningful results in the East. The financial preparations for Edward's crusade revealed both the scale of his ambitions and the continuing limitations of royal resources. Contemporary estimates suggest that a properly equipped crusading expedition would require approximately 100,000 marks, an enormous sum equivalent to several years of normal royal revenue. Edward's household accounts show expenditures on weapons, armour, siege engines, and transport ships that dwarf the costs of his previous military campaigns in Wales and Gascony. The prince's approach to crusade financing demonstrated the administrative skills he had developed during his years governing Gascony. Rather than relying solely on traditional feudal obligations or royal subsidies, Edward negotiated loans from Italian banking houses, particularly the Riccardi of Lucca, who had established extensive operations in England. These arrangements required sophisticated financial instruments, including letters of credit that could be honoured in Mediterranean ports, and currency exchange mechanisms that allowed English silver to be converted into the gold bezants preferred for Eastern trade. Edward also implemented innovative taxation measures within his own territories to raise crusading funds. His officials conducted detailed surveys of manorial resources, assessed the taxable capacity of urban communities, and negotiated special contributions from ecclesiastical institutions. These efforts generated significant revenue but also created tensions with local populations who questioned whether crusading taxation should take precedence over domestic needs. The most serious conflict over crusade financing erupted between Edward and his father over the prince's attempts to impose extraordinary levies on royal domain lands. Henry III, still struggling to restore royal finances after the expensive Barons' War, argued that Edward's taxation demands would undermine broader efforts to stabilise royal revenues. The dispute escalated when Edward's officials began collecting taxes without explicit royal authorisation, creating a constitutional crisis over the extent of the prince's independent authority. The resolution of this taxation dispute required delicate negotiations mediated by ecclesiastical leaders who supported the crusading enterprise. Archbishop Robert Kilwardby of Canterbury and several prominent bishops intervened to broker a compromise that allowed Edward to proceed with his financial preparations while acknowledging Henry III's ultimate authority over royal taxation. The agreement established precedents for princely autonomy that would later influence Edward's approach to governing his own territories. Edward's departure from England in August 1270 marked the beginning of an odyssey that would transform his understanding of European politics and military strategy. The prince travelled with a substantial retinue that included approximately 1,000 knights and men-at-arms, along with the extensive support personnel required for such an expedition. His ships carried not only weapons and armour but also the prefabricated components of siege engines, suggesting that Edward anticipated major military operations rather than merely a ceremonial pilgrimage. The journey to the Holy Land followed established pilgrimage routes that had been refined over 2 centuries of crusading activity. Edward's fleet first made landfall in France, where the prince participated in final coordination meetings with Louis IX and other crusading leaders. These discussions revealed significant disagreements about strategic objectives, with Louis favouring an initial assault on Tunis to secure the southern Mediterranean approaches to the Holy Land, while Edward and other leaders argued for direct intervention in Syria to relieve pressure on Acre. The French king's decision to proceed with the Tunisian expedition, despite these objections, reflected both his personal conviction that converting the Muslim rulers of North Africa offered the best long-term solution to Christian problems in the East, and his practical need to secure French commercial interests in the Western Mediterranean. Louis's strategic vision encompassed not merely the immediate relief of existing Crusader territories, but the creation of a broader Christian alliance that could permanently alter the balance of power between Christianity and Islam. Edward's participation in the planning sessions with Louis IX provided him with unprecedented exposure to high-level diplomatic and military decision-making. The French court represented the pinnacle of medieval European civilization, with administrative systems and cultural institutions that far exceeded anything available in 13th century England. The prince observed sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations, complex logistical planning, and diplomatic negotiations that involved representatives from across the Mediterranean world. The diplomatic dimensions of crusade planning required Edward to navigate relationships with a bewildering array of European nobles, each bringing their own territorial interests and strategic priorities to the common enterprise. Charles of Anjou, Louis IX's brother and King of Sicily, emerged as a particularly important figure whose support was essential for securing safe passage through the central Mediterranean and access to supplies in Italian ports. Charles of Anjou's position as ruler of Sicily and southern Italy made him a crucial intermediary between the crusading forces and the Byzantine Empire, whose cooperation was necessary for any sustained military operations in the eastern Mediterranean. The Angevin king had spent years consolidating his control over his Italian territories through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic manoeuvring that had eliminated the last remnants of Hohenstaufen influence in the region. Edward's negotiations with Charles of Anjou revealed the complex web of interests that shaped 13th century Mediterranean politics. The Sicilian king's primary concerns focused on securing his southern Italian borders against potential Byzantine or papal interference, while maintaining the commercial relationships that provided revenue for his ambitious territorial projects. His support for the crusade depended partly on guarantees that other participants would not challenge his Italian interests during their absence in the East. The tragic conclusion of Louis IX's Tunisian expedition fundamentally altered the strategic situation facing Edward and the other crusading leaders. The French king's death from disease in August 1270, shortly after the capture of Tunis, deprived the crusade of its most prestigious leader and created uncertainty about the expedition's future direction. Many French nobles chose to return home with their king's body, significantly reducing the military resources available for operations in the Holy Land. Edward's decision to continue eastward, despite the collapse of the main French expedition, demonstrated both his personal commitment to the crusading ideal and his recognition that retreat would damage his reputation throughout Europe. The prince assumed leadership of the remaining crusading forces, which included substantial contingents from English territories, Gascon nobles, and various Mediterranean powers who remained committed to intervention in Syria. The reduced expedition that finally reached Acre in May 1271 represented a fraction of the massive force originally envisioned by Louis IX and his fellow crusading leaders. Edward's army probably numbered fewer than 1,000 knights and perhaps 5,000 infantry, hardly sufficient for the kind of major offensive operations that might have reversed Christian fortunes in the Holy Land. Nevertheless, the prince's arrival provided a significant morale boost to the beleaguered defenders of Acre and demonstrated continuing Western commitment to the Crusader cause. The military situation Edward encountered in Acre bore little resemblance to the romanticised accounts of earlier crusading literature. the once mighty Crusader states had been reduced to a narrow coastal strip dominated by the massive fortifications of Acre itself. The city's population included not only Latin Christians, but also substantial communities of Eastern Christians, Muslims and Jews, all living in an uneasy accommodation shaped by 2 centuries of cultural exchange and military conflict. Edward's initial military operations focused on securing the immediate environs of Acre against Mamluk raiding parties that threatened the city's agricultural hinterland and commercial connections. These campaigns required careful coordination with the local military orders, particularly the Templars and Hospitallers, whose knowledge of regional conditions and established intelligence networks proved invaluable for planning effective operations. The prince's approach to warfare in the Holy Land demonstrated the tactical innovations he'd absorbed during his campaigns in Wales and Gascony. Rather than relying solely on traditional cavalry charges, Edward employed combined arms tactics that integrated heavy cavalry with crossbow units and siege specialists. His forces also made extensive use of field fortifications and strategic mobility, avoiding the kind of catastrophic defeats that had characterized many earlier crusading expeditions. The most significant military achievement of Edward's crusade was his successful raid on the town of Cocoon in November 1271, which demonstrated that Christian forces could still conduct effective offensive operations despite their numerical disadvantages. The operation required careful intelligence gathering, precise timing, and the coordination of multiple columns advancing through difficult terrain. The successful capture and systematic destruction of Cocoon sent a clear message to Mamluk commanders that the Christian presence in the Holy Land retained significant military capabilities. However, Edward's military successes could not disguise the fundamental strategic hopelessness of the Christian position in the Levant. Baibars commanded vastly superior resources and could draw upon the full military potential of Egypt and Syria, while the Crusader territories depended entirely on irregular reinforcements from Europe. The prince's correspondence with Henry III and other European rulers during this period reveals his growing recognition that only a massive, sustained commitment of Western resources could preserve Christian rule in the Holy Land. The assassination attempt that occurred in Acre during the summer of 1272 became one of the defining moments of Edward's crusade, though the exact circumstances remain disputed among contemporary sources. The basic facts appear to be that a Muslim assassin, possibly sent by Baibars or acting independently, gained access to Edward's quarters and wounded the prince with a poisoned dagger before being killed by Edward's retainers. The medical treatment Edward received following the assassination attempt reflected the sophisticated medical knowledge available in 13th century Acre, where Christian, Muslim and Jewish physicians had developed advanced techniques for treating wounds and combating poison. Contemporary accounts suggest that Edward's recovery required several weeks of intensive care, during which Eleanor of Castile remained constantly at his bedside, contributing to the romantic legends that later surrounded the incident. The political implications of the assassination attempt extended far beyond its immediate medical consequences. The attack demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of Mamluk intelligence operations and the vulnerability of Christian leaders despite their elaborate security precautions. For Edward personally, the experience reinforced his understanding of the deadly serious nature of the conflict between Christianity and Islam in the Eastern Mediterranean. The gradual recognition that his crusade could achieve only limited objectives led Edward to begin negotiations for his return to Europe by early 1272. Reports from England indicated that Henry III's health was declining rapidly, creating the possibility that Edward might soon inherit the throne. The prince's presence in England during a royal transition would be essential for ensuring political stability and preventing the kind of succession crisis that had plagued other European kingdoms. Edward's departure preparations required complex negotiations with the remaining Crusader authorities to ensure that his withdrawal would not precipitate the complete collapse of Christian resistance in the Holy Land. The prince arranged for continued financial support to the military orders and helped negotiate a temporary truce with Baibars that would preserve Acre and the remaining Christian territories for at least the immediate future. The return journey through Italy and France provided Edward with opportunities to strengthen diplomatic relationships that would prove crucial during his later reign as king. His extended stay in Rome allowed for detailed discussions with Pope Gregory XIII about the future of crusading policy and the broader relationship between secular and ecclesiastical authority in Christian Europe. These conversations influenced Edward's later approach to church-state relations in England and his continued interest in crusading projects. The news of Henry III's death on November 16, 1272, reached Edward while he was travelling through Italy, probably in the vicinity of Rome. The prince's reaction to his father's death revealed both genuine grief and practical recognition of the enormous responsibilities he was about to inherit. Unlike many medieval succession crises, Edward's accession proceeded smoothly, with the English nobility accepting his kingship without significant opposition despite his absence from the realm. Edward's return to England in August 1274, nearly 2 years after his father's death, marked the beginning of the most intensive period of administrative and legal reform in medieval English history. The kingdom he inherited bore the scars of decades of political instability, financial mismanagement, and administrative decay. Henry III's well-intentioned but often ineffective governance had left royal authority weakened, the treasury depleted, and the machinery of government operating with questionable efficiency. The new king, seasoned by his experiences in Gascony, the baronial wars, and the crucible of crusading warfare, possessed both the vision and determination necessary to transform England into a more centralised and effectively governed realm. The coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey on August 19, 1274, deliberately emphasised continuity with Anglo-Saxon traditions while asserting the divine nature of Plantagenet kingship. Edward wore the crown of Edward the Confessor and carried the ceremonial sword attributed to the pre-Norman Saint King, symbols that connected his reign to England's ancient royal heritage. However, the elaborate ritual also incorporated elements borrowed from French and imperial coronation ceremonies, reflecting Edward's exposure to continental concepts of royal authority during his travels through Europe. The assembled nobility who witnessed Edward's coronation represented a complex amalgamation of Norman, Anglo-Saxon, and foreign-born families whose loyalties had been tested during the previous generation's political upheavals. Many had supported the baronial reform movement at various stages, while others had remained consistently loyal to royal authority. Edward's challenge lay in transforming this fractious aristocracy into an effective instrument of royal governance while preventing the emergence of new opposition coalitions that might challenge his authority. The administrative machinery Edward inherited reflected the accumulated reforms and improvisations of 2 centuries of Plantagenet rule, but lacked the systematic organisation necessary for governing an increasingly complex realm. The royal household remained the centre of government, with the Chancellor, Treasurer and other great officers managing both domestic administration and the king's personal affairs. However, the growth of governmental business had created overlapping jurisdictions, unclear lines of authority and inefficient procedures that hindered effective decision-making and implementation. Edward's first major initiative involved commissioning a comprehensive survey of royal rights, privileges and properties throughout England, an undertaking that would become known as the Great Survey. This massive administrative project required the deployment of specially trained commissioners who travelled to every county conducting detailed investigations into the extent of royal authority and the obligations owed by landholders to the Crown. The survey's scope exceeded even the Domesday Book in its systematic examination of legal relationships and property rights. The commissioners appointed to conduct the Great Survey represented Edward's attempt to create a professional administrative class capable of implementing royal policy with unprecedented precision and consistency. These officials typically possessed legal training, often acquired at the emerging universities of Oxford and Cambridge, and demonstrated loyalty to royal interests rather than local or baronial connections. Their appointments marked a significant departure from the traditional reliance on great nobles for administrative leadership. The investigative methods employed during the Great Survey revealed the influence of Roman law concepts that Edward had encountered during his continental travels. The commissioners operated under standardized instructions that required systematic documentation of evidence, testimony from sworn witnesses, and written records of all proceedings. This procedural uniformity represented a revolutionary departure from the customary, largely oral traditions that had previously governed English legal proceedings. The information gathered through the Great Survey exposed widespread usurpation of royal rights and systematic evasion of feudal obligations by landholders throughout England. Local magnates had appropriated judicial authority, established unauthorised markets and fairs, and claimed exemptions from royal taxation without proper legal foundation. The scale of these encroachments suggested that royal authority had deteriorated far more extensively than previously understood, requiring comprehensive remedial action to restore effective governance. The Quo Warranto proceedings that followed the Great Survey represented Edward's most aggressive assertion of royal prerogatives since the Norman conquest. These legal actions required landholders to produce written evidence justifying their exercise of governmental authority, market rights, and judicial privileges. The Latin phrase quo warranto, meaning by what warrant, became the rallying cry for a systematic campaign to eliminate unauthorised exercise of royal prerogatives throughout the realm. The legal theory underlying the Quo Warranto proceedings drew heavily from Roman law concepts of sovereignty that treated all governmental authority as ultimately derived from royal grant. This represented a fundamental challenge to the customary English assumption that ancient usage could establish legitimate rights independent of royal confirmation. Edward's lawyers argued that only explicit royal charters or grants could authorise the exercise of governmental functions, regardless of how long such authority had been exercised. The practical implementation of Quo Warranto proceedings required the creation of specialised courts staffed by royal justices trained in the new legal procedures. These tribunals operated according to strict evidentiary standards that favoured written documentation over oral testimony and royal grants over customary claims. The proceedings generated enormous resistance from landholders who faced the potential loss of profitable rights and privileges that had been exercised for generations. The most significant confrontation during the Quo Warranto campaign occurred with John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, who reportedly responded to demands for written evidence of his judicial authority by producing an ancient rusty sword and declaring that his ancestors had conquered their lands with steel and would defend them by the same means. This dramatic gesture symbolised the broader conflict between traditional feudal concepts of legitimacy and Edward's new emphasis on bureaucratic documentation and royal authorisation. Edward's response to aristocratic resistance demonstrated both his determination to assert royal authority and his practical recognition of political limitations. Rather than pursuing wholesale confiscation of disputed rights, the king offered composition agreements that allowed landholders to retain their privileges in exchange for acknowledgement of royal supremacy and payment of substantial fines. These settlements generated significant revenue for the royal treasury, while establishing important precedents for royal control over governmental functions. The reorganisation of royal justice that accompanied the Quo Warranto proceedings transformed the structure and operation of English courts throughout the realm. Edward established regular circuits for royal justices, standardised legal procedures across different jurisdictions, and created specialised courts for particular types of cases. The Court of King's Bench assumed enhanced importance as the premier royal tribunal, while the Court of Common Pleas handled routine civil litigation according to increasingly sophisticated procedural rules. The recruitment and training of royal justices reflected Edward's commitment to creating a professional judiciary capable of implementing royal policy with consistency and expertise. Many appointees possessed university education, particularly in canon law and the revived Roman law that was transforming European legal systems. These professionally trained judges gradually displaced the local magnates and ecclesiastical officials who had previously dominated English judicial administration. The development of standardized legal procedures represented one of Edward's most lasting contributions to English governance. The new court systems operated according to written rules that specified procedures for initiating cases, presenting evidence, and reaching judgments. These innovations reduced the arbitrary exercise of judicial authority, while ensuring that royal courts maintained consistent standards throughout the realm. The First Statute of Westminster, promulgated in 1275, codified many of the legal reforms that had emerged from Edward's administrative investigations and judicial reorganisation. This comprehensive legislation addressed dozens of specific legal problems that had been identified during the Great Survey, ranging from inheritance disputes to commercial regulations. The statute's systematic approach to legal reform demonstrated Edward's determination to create a coherent body of law that would govern all aspects of English society. The statute's provisions concerning inheritance law reflected Edward's broader concern with establishing clear rules for property transmission that would prevent disputes and strengthen royal authority. The legislation specified procedures for determining legitimate heirs, established requirements for documenting property transfers, and created mechanisms for resolving inheritance disputes through royal courts. These reforms reduced the potential for violent conflicts over property rights, while ensuring that the Crown received appropriate feudal obligations from new landholders. Commercial regulations included in the First Statute of Westminster addressed the growing importance of trade and urban development in 13th century England. The legislation established standardized weights and measures, regulated market operations, and specified procedures for resolving commercial disputes. These provisions reflected Edward's recognition that economic prosperity required reliable legal frameworks that could protect merchants and encourage investment in productive activities. The criminal law provisions of the statute demonstrated Edward's determination to establish royal monopoly over serious criminal jurisdiction throughout England. The legislation expanded the definition of felonies subject to royal prosecution, specified procedures for criminal investigations, and established penalties for various categories of offences. These reforms reduced the authority of local courts while ensuring that serious crimes would be prosecuted according to consistent royal standards. The Second Statute of Westminster, enacted in 1285, represented the culmination of Edward's legal reform programme and established many principles that would govern English law for centuries. This massive piece of legislation, known as De Donis Conditionalibus, addressed fundamental questions about property rights, inheritance law, and the relationship between landholders and the Crown. The statute's complexity reflected the sophisticated legal thinking that had developed during Edward's reign. The most significant provision of the Second Statute of Westminster entailed estates, a form of property holding that restricted the rights of current owners to alienate land outside their family lines. This innovation allowed landholders to ensure that their properties would remain within their families in perpetuity, while also guaranteeing that the Crown would continue to receive feudal services from successive generations of landholders. The creation of entailed estates represented a compromise between aristocratic desires for family continuity and royal requirements for reliable feudal obligations. The legal mechanisms established for creating and maintaining entailed estates required sophisticated documentation and judicial oversight that strengthened royal authority over property relationships throughout England. Landholders seeking to establish entails had to obtain royal approval and submit to ongoing royal supervision of their property arrangements. These requirements created new sources of royal revenue while ensuring that the Crown maintained detailed knowledge of property holdings throughout the realm. The statute's provisions concerning legal procedures reflected Edward's continuing efforts to professionalise English justice and reduce arbitrary decision-making by local officials. The legislation established detailed rules for conducting trials, presenting evidence, and appealing judicial decisions. These procedural innovations ensured that royal courts operated according to consistent standards, while providing mechanisms for correcting errors and preventing abuse of judicial authority. Edward's monetary reforms represented another crucial component of his broader programme for strengthening royal authority and improving governmental efficiency. The English currency system he inherited suffered from widespread debasement, counterfeiting, and the circulation of foreign coins that complicated commercial transactions and reduced royal revenues from minting operations. The king's solution involved recalling all existing currency and issuing new coins according to improved standards of purity and weight. The technical aspects of Edward's monetary reform reflected contemporary advances in metallurgy and minting technology that the king had observed during his continental travels. The new coins featured more sophisticated designs that were difficult to counterfeit, while improved production techniques ensured consistent weight and purity standards. The royal mints established standardized procedures that allowed for quality control and prevented the unauthorized alteration of official currency. The economic impact of monetary reform extended far beyond the immediate benefits of improved currency standards. The recall and reissue of coinage generated substantial profits for the royal treasury, as the crown retained the difference between the face value of new coins and the actual value of the precious metals they contained. These seigniorage profits provided Edward with financial resources that were not subject to traditional limitations on royal taxation. The circulation of standardized royal currency throughout England facilitated commercial development by reducing transaction costs and eliminating uncertainties about coin values. Merchants could conduct business with confidence that royal coins would be accepted at face value throughout the realm, while the elimination of foreign and debased currency simplified accounting and reduced opportunities for fraud. Edward's approach to Jewish money lending reflected both his financial needs and the religious prejudices of 13th century Christian Europe. English Jews had traditionally provided credit services that were forbidden to Christians under canonical prohibitions against usury, but their wealth and economic prominence generated resentment among Christian debtors and provided opportunities for royal financial exploitation. The Statute of Jewry, enacted in 1275, represented Edward's attempt to regulate Jewish economic activities while extracting maximum revenue from Jewish communities. The legislation prohibited Jews from engaging in money lending while requiring them to pursue alternative occupations such as agriculture, crafts, or commerce. However, the practical implementation of these restrictions proved difficult, as few alternative economic opportunities existed for Jewish communities that had specialized in financial services for generations. The enforcement of restrictions on Jewish money lending created significant economic disruption throughout England, as Christian borrowers lost access to traditional sources of credit, while Jewish communities faced impoverishment and social displacement. Many Jews attempted to evade the new restrictions through various subterfuges, including partnerships with Christian associates and the use of complex financial instruments that disguised lending transactions as commercial partnerships. Edward's ultimate solution to the Jewish question involved the complete expulsion of Jewish communities from England in 1290, making England the first major European kingdom to implement such a comprehensive policy. The expulsion order required all Jews to leave the realm by November 1st, 1290, while allowing them to take movable property but forbidding the transfer of real estate or outstanding debts. The castle-building program that Edward initiated during the early years of his reign represented both a military necessity and a powerful symbol of royal authority throughout England. The strategic placement of new fortifications reflected careful analysis of potential threats to royal authority. while their architectural sophistication demonstrated the Crown's access to advanced military engineering and substantial financial resources. The design principles underlying Edward's castle construction reflected innovations in military architecture that he had observed during his crusading expedition and continental travels. The new fortifications featured concentric defensive systems, sophisticated siege-resistant features, and residential accommodations suitable for permanent royal administration. These castles served not only as military strongholds, but also as centres of royal government that projected royal authority throughout their surrounding regions. The construction of new castles required massive expenditures of royal resources and the mobilisation of skilled craftsmen, engineers, and labourers from throughout England and continental Europe. Master masons, military engineers, and specialised artisans commanded high wages and contributed technological innovations that advanced English capabilities in military architecture and construction techniques. The establishment of new towns represented another crucial component of Edward's programme for strengthening royal authority and promoting economic development throughout England. These planned communities, known as bastides, followed models that Edward had encountered in Gascony and other continental territories. The new towns featured standardised layouts, market privileges, and legal frameworks designed to attract settlers and promote commercial activity. The legal status of Edward's new towns differed significantly from traditional English urban communities, which had typically developed through gradual evolution and the accumulation of customary privileges. The planned towns received comprehensive charters that specified their governmental structures, commercial rights, and relationships with royal authority. These charters created urban communities that were directly subordinate to royal control rather than local magnates. The economic incentives offered to settlers in Edward's new towns included temporary tax exemptions, guaranteed market rights, and protection from feudal obligations that might interfere with commercial activities. These privileges attracted merchants, craftsmen, and agricultural workers who sought opportunities for economic advancement outside traditional feudal relationships. The success of Edward's town-founding programme varied considerably depending on local conditions, strategic location, and the availability of economic opportunities. Some communities flourished and became permanent additions to England's urban network, while others failed to attract sufficient settlers and eventually disappeared. However, the overall programme demonstrated Edward's commitment to promoting economic development as a means of strengthening royal authority and increasing royal revenues. The administrative and legal reforms that had occupied Edward's attention during his first years as king were abruptly overshadowed by developments along England's western frontier. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales, had exploited the period of English political instability following Henry III's death to consolidate his authority throughout much of Wales and challenge the feudal relationship that theoretically subordinated Welsh princes to English royal authority. By 1276, Llywelyn's actions had escalated beyond mere territorial expansion to constitute what Edward perceived as open rebellion against the English crown. Llywelyn's rise to dominance in Wales represented the culmination of decades of political consolidation that had transformed the fractured Welsh principalities into something approaching a unified kingdom. Following his victory over his brothers at the Battle of Bryn Derwin in 1255, Llywelyn had systematically eliminated rival claimants to authority within Gwynedd, while extending his influence over the lesser Welsh princes of Powys and Deheubarth. The Treaty of Montgomery in 1267 had recognised Llywelyn as Prince of Wales, acknowledging his supremacy over other Welsh rulers while maintaining the theoretical fiction of the English overlordship. The specific grievances that precipitated the First Welsh War emerged from Llywelyn's refusal to perform homage to Edward, following the English king's accession in 1272. Welsh legal traditions emphasised that homage constituted a personal relationship between ruler and vassal that required renewal upon the succession of either party. Llywelyn's failure to appear at Edward's coronation or subsequent summons to perform homage violated the fundamental principles of feudal law and provided Edward with clear legal justification for military intervention. The underlying causes of conflict extended far beyond questions of feudal protocol to encompass fundamental disagreements about the nature of Welsh independence and the extent of English authority over Celtic territories. Llywelyn had spent years building relationships with Scottish nobles and continental rulers who might support Welsh independence, while simultaneously strengthening the military capabilities of Welsh forces through the adoption of English tactical innovations and the construction of stone fortifications modelled on English castle designs. Edward's military preparations for the Welsh campaign demonstrated the administrative efficiency and financial resources that his domestic reforms had created. The king's household officials compiled detailed registers of feudal obligations, summoning knights and men-at-arms from throughout England, according to precisely calculated quotas based on landholding assessments. The royal treasury allocated substantial sums for purchasing supplies, hiring mercenaries, and constructing the siege engines that would prove essential for reducing Welsh strongholds. The strategic approach Edward adopted for the Welsh campaign reflected his understanding of the geographical and logistical challenges involved in conquering mountainous terrain, defended by forces intimately familiar with local conditions. Rather than attempting a single massive invasion that might become bogged down in the Welsh interior, Edward planned a systematic advance that would establish secure bases for further operations while denying Welsh forces access to the coastal resources that sustained their resistance. The initial phase of the First Welsh War commenced in July 1277, with Edward's establishment of a fortified base at Chester, from which English forces could control the crucial Dee Valley and threaten Llywelyn's stronghold in Gwynedd. The king's army included approximately 15,000 infantry, recruited from English counties, supplemented by 800 heavy cavalry, and substantial numbers of crossbowmen, whose mechanical weapons provided significant advantages over traditional Welsh archery in siege warfare. The composition of Edward's invasion force reflected his systematic approach to military organisation and his understanding of the specialised requirements for warfare in Welsh terrain. The infantry contingents included large numbers of experienced soldiers recruited from the Welsh borderlands, men who possessed intimate knowledge of Welsh tactics and terrain while maintaining loyalty to English overlords. These border troops served as guides, interpreters and specialists in the kind of irregular warfare that characterised Welsh resistance. Edward's employment of Gascon crossbowmen demonstrated his willingness to utilise continental military innovations that had proven effective during his earlier campaigns in France. These professional soldiers brought sophisticated siege techniques and mechanical weapons that could penetrate Welsh fortifications and provide covering fire for assault troops. Their presence also signalled Edward's intention to conduct the Welsh campaign according to the higher standards of contemporary military practice, rather than relying solely on traditional English feudal levies. The logistical arrangements for sustaining Edward's army in Wales required unprecedented coordination between royal administrators, local officials, and commercial suppliers throughout England. The king's household established supply depots at strategic locations along the invasion routes, while royal ships transported provisions from English ports to support coastal operations. These arrangements ensured that English forces could maintain their offensive momentum without becoming vulnerable to Welsh efforts to disrupt their supply lines. The advance into Wales proceeded according to Edward's systematic plan, with English forces securing key river valleys and mountain passes while establishing fortified positions that could serve as bases for further operations. The capture of Flint in August 1277 provided Edward with a secure foothold in northeastern Wales, while the simultaneous advance of English forces through the Severn Valley threatened Llywelyn's communications with his allies in central and southern Wales. Llywelyn's initial response to the English invasion demonstrated both his military capabilities and the fundamental weaknesses of Welsh resistance. Welsh forces successfully harassed English supply lines and inflicted casualties through ambush tactics and guerrilla warfare, but lacked the resources and organisation necessary for sustained resistance against Edward's systematic advance. The Welsh prince's attempts to coordinate resistance among the various Welsh territories were hampered by traditional rivalries and the limited military resources available to individual Welsh rulers. The decisive moment of the First Welsh War occurred with Edward's successful crossing of the Menai Strait in November 1277, which isolated Llywelyn in the mountainous interior of Snowdonia while cutting off his access to the fertile agricultural lands of Anglesey that provided much of Gwyned's food supply. The English construction of a pontoon bridge across the treacherous tidal waters demonstrated sophisticated military engineering capabilities that completely surprised Welsh defenders. The engineering achievement represented by Edward's Menai crossing required careful coordination between military engineers, naval specialists, and local pilots familiar with the complex tidal patterns that made the strait so dangerous for conventional shipping. The bridge construction utilised prefabricated components that had been prepared in advance and transported to the crossing site under heavy military escort. The successful completion of this project within a matter of days demonstrated the advanced logistical capabilities that Edward's administrative reforms had created. Llywelyn's capitulation in the Treaty of Aberconwy in November 1277 reflected his recognition that continued resistance was impossible without access to Anglesey's agricultural resources and external military support that had failed to materialise. The treaty terms required Llywelyn to acknowledge Edward's overlordship, pay a substantial indemnity, and surrender control of all Welsh territories outside Gwynedd proper. The agreement also required Llywelyn to provide hostages as guarantees of future compliance with English demands. The territorial provisions of the Treaty of Aberconwy reduced Llywelyn's authority to a fraction of its former extent, limiting his direct control to the mountainous core of Gwynedd, while placing other Welsh territories under direct English administration or the authority of Welsh princes who acknowledged English overlordship. This dramatic reduction of Welsh independence created the conditions for future conflict, while providing Edward with the legal framework necessary for establishing permanent English control over much of Wales. Edward's implementation of the Aberconwy settlement involved the immediate construction of new castles at strategic locations throughout the conquered territories, establishing permanent English military presence that could prevent any resurgence of Welsh resistance. The castle-building programme represented the most ambitious military construction project undertaken in medieval Britain, requiring the mobilisation of thousands of skilled craftsmen and labourers from throughout England and continental Europe. The architectural innovations incorporated into Edward's Welsh castles reflected the latest developments in European military engineering, particularly the concentric defensive systems that had proven effective during recent conflicts in France and the Holy Land. Master James of St. George, the Savoyard military engineer whom Edward recruited to oversee the castle construction programme, brought expertise gained through decades of experience building fortifications throughout continental Europe. Master James of St. George's background as a military engineer in the service of Count Philip of Savoy had provided him with extensive experience in constructing castles designed to control hostile populations and resist sophisticated siege techniques. His work on the fortifications of Saint-Georges d'Espéranche in the Rhône Valley had established his reputation as one of Europe's premier castle builders, capable of integrating the latest innovations in military architecture with practical considerations of cost and construction logistics. The concentric castle design that Master James brought to Wales represented a revolutionary advance over traditional English fortification concepts. These castles featured multiple lines of defence, with outer walls protecting inner bailies that contained the main residential and administrative structures. The concentric arrangement allowed defenders to maintain resistance even if outer defences were breached, while providing overlapping fields of fire that could devastate attacking forces. The construction of Flint Castle, begun immediately following the English conquest of northeastern Wales, demonstrated the sophisticated planning and massive resources that Edward was prepared to commit to his Welsh castle programme. The castle's design incorporated a unique round keep that projected beyond the main defensive perimeter, providing an independent stronghold that could continue resistance even if the main castle fell to attackers. The construction required the importation of specialised limestone from quarries in the Pennines, transported by sea to minimise costs and construction time. The workforce assembled for castle construction included master masons recruited from throughout England and continental Europe, skilled carpenters capable of constructing the complex wooden frameworks required for stone construction, and thousands of labourers whose efforts made possible the rapid completion of these massive projects. The daily wage records preserved in royal accounts indicate that Edward paid premium rates to attract the best available craftsmen, while also providing comprehensive logistical support that ensured uninterrupted construction progress. The strategic placement of Edward's Welsh castles reflected careful analysis of the geographical factors that would determine their effectiveness in controlling the surrounding territories. Flint controlled the Dee estuary and the main route between England and northwestern Wales, while Rhuddlan commanded the Vale of Clwyd and provided a secure base for further operations into the Welsh interior. Each castle location was selected to maximise its contribution to an integrated defensive system that would make future Welsh resistance impossible. The Iron Ring strategy that emerged from Edward's castle construction programme created a network of mutually supporting fortifications that could coordinate their defensive efforts while maintaining secure communications with England. The coastal locations of most castles ensured that English naval forces could provide supplies and reinforcements even if land routes were temporarily disrupted by Welsh resistance. This strategic concept represented a fundamental departure from traditional English approaches to Welsh defence, which had relied primarily on border fortifications and periodic punitive expeditions. The administrative arrangements established for governing the conquered Welsh territories reflected Edward's determination to integrate these lands permanently into the English governmental system. The new counties of Flint and Anglesey were organised according to English administrative models, with sheriffs, justices and other royal officials implementing English law and collecting royal revenues according to standardised procedures. These arrangements eliminated the traditional Welsh legal and administrative systems that had sustained Welsh independence for centuries. The imposition of English legal procedures in the conquered territories generated significant resistance from Welsh populations, who found themselves subject to unfamiliar laws administered by foreign officials. The English emphasis on written documentation, formal court procedures, and monetary penalties conflicted with Welsh legal traditions that emphasised oral testimony, customary law, and compensation through kinship networks. These cultural conflicts created ongoing tensions that would contribute to the outbreak of renewed warfare. The economic exploitation of conquered Welsh territories provided Edward with substantial revenues that helped offset the enormous costs of castle construction and military occupation. The royal administration imposed new taxes on Welsh agricultural production, established English-controlled markets that displaced traditional Welsh commercial networks, and granted profitable privileges to English settlers who were encouraged to establish communities in the newly conquered lands. The settlement of English colonists in Wales represented a deliberate policy designed to alter the demographic balance in strategically important areas while providing reliable populations that would support continued English rule. These settlers received grants of agricultural land, urban properties and commercial privileges that were denied to Welsh inhabitants. The preferential treatment accorded to English settlers created resentment among Welsh populations and contributed to the underlying tensions that would eventually explode into renewed warfare. The period of relative peace that followed the Treaty of Aberconwy proved to be merely a temporary respite that had allowed both sides to prepare for renewed conflict. Llywelyn utilised the breathing space to rebuild his military capabilities, strengthen his remaining fortifications, and cultivate relationships with potential allies who might support renewed resistance to English rule. Meanwhile, Edward continued his castle construction programme and refined the administrative systems that would be necessary for permanent control over Wales. The specific incidents that precipitated the Second Welsh War emerged from the accumulated grievances and cultural conflicts that English rule had created throughout Wales. The harsh administration of English officials, the preferential treatment accorded to English settlers, and the systematic suppression of Welsh legal and cultural traditions generated widespread resentment that found expression in increasingly frequent acts of resistance and rebellion. The outbreak of coordinated Welsh resistance in March 1282 caught English authorities off guard, despite the obvious signs of growing Welsh discontent. The rebellion began with attacks on English castles and settlements throughout Wales, coordinated through networks of Welsh nobles who had maintained secret communications despite English surveillance efforts. The simultaneous nature of these attacks indicated sophisticated planning and suggested that Welsh resistance possessed greater organisational capabilities than English officials had recognised. Llywelyn's decision to support the rebellion represented a calculated gamble based on his assessment that English control over Wales remained fundamentally unstable despite the impressive castle fortifications and administrative systems that Edward had established. The Welsh prince recognised that his own position had become untenable under English overlordship and that only successful rebellion could restore meaningful Welsh independence. The Second Welsh War differed significantly from the earlier conflict in both its scope and intensity. Welsh resistance was more widespread and better coordinated than in 1277, while English forces faced the additional challenge of defending their newly established positions throughout Wales, rather than simply conducting offensive operations from secure English bases. The conflict quickly escalated into a struggle for the very survival of Welsh independence. Edward's response to the Welsh rebellion demonstrated both his military capabilities and his determination to achieve a final solution to the Welsh problem. The king mobilised substantially larger forces than he had employed during the First Welsh War, while also implementing more systematic strategies designed to eliminate Welsh resistance permanently, rather than merely securing temporary submission. The military operations of the Second Welsh War were characterised by unprecedented brutality and systematic destruction, as both sides recognised that the conflict would determine the ultimate fate of Welsh independence. English forces implemented scorched earth tactics designed to deny Welsh rebels access to food and shelter, while Welsh resistance responded with guerrilla warfare that targeted English civilians and administrative personnel throughout the occupied territories. The death of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd on December 11, 1282, near Builth Wells, marked the effective end of organised Welsh resistance and the collapse of the last independent Welsh principality. The circumstances of Llywelyn's death remain disputed, with some accounts suggesting that he was killed in a skirmish with English forces, while others indicate that he was betrayed by Welsh allies who had secretly negotiated with English authorities. The betrayal that led to Llywelyn's death reflected the fundamental weakness of Welsh resistance, which depended on maintaining unity among Welsh nobles whose traditional rivalries and competing interests made sustained cooperation extremely difficult. English diplomatic efforts had successfully exploited these divisions, offering attractive terms to Welsh leaders who were willing to abandon the independence struggle in exchange for preservation of their local authority under English overlordship. The final collapse of Welsh independence following Llywelyn's death was swift and comprehensive. His brother Dafydd, who had assumed leadership of the resistance movement, was captured in June 1283 and subsequently executed as a traitor, while other Welsh nobles either fled into exile or submitted to English authority. The systematic nature of English victory eliminated any possibility of future Welsh independence movements based on traditional princely leadership. The Statute of Rhuddlan, promulgated by Edward in March 1284, established the legal and administrative framework that would govern English rule in Wales for the remainder of the medieval period. This comprehensive legislation created the new counties of Anglesey, Caernarfon and Merioneth in northwestern Wales, while extending the existing counties of Carmarthen and Cardigan in the southwest. The statute imposed English legal procedures throughout Wales while preserving certain Welsh customs in matters of inheritance and property rights. The administrative provisions of the Statute of Rhuddlan created governmental structures modelled closely on English county administration, with sheriffs, coroners, and justices implementing royal authority according to standardised procedures. These officials were typically English appointees whose loyalty to the crown was unquestioned, though the statute did provide for the employment of Welsh personnel in subordinate positions where their local knowledge and language skills were deemed essential. The legal changes imposed by the Statute of Rhuddlan represented a fundamental transformation of Welsh society that eliminated traditional Welsh law in favour of English legal procedures and concepts. The statute required all serious criminal cases to be tried in English royal courts according to English legal procedures, while civil disputes involving significant property interests were similarly transferred to English jurisdiction. These changes undermined the authority of traditional Welsh legal institutions and the cultural autonomy they had represented. The creation of the Principality of Wales as an appanage for the English heir represented Edward's solution to the problem of governing the conquered Welsh territories while maintaining their symbolic distinctiveness. The arrangement announced at Caernarfon in 1301 designated Edward's son as Prince of Wales, while ensuring that the principality would remain permanently united with the English crown. This constitutional innovation provided a model for the future governance of other conquered territories while satisfying English desires for complete control over Wales. The colonisation policies implemented in conquered Wales involved the systematic replacement of Welsh populations in strategically important areas with English settlers who would provide reliable support for continued English rule. The new English boroughs established at Caernarfon, Conwy and other locations received extensive privileges and protections that were denied to Welsh inhabitants, creating permanent English enclaves that could serve as centres of royal authority throughout Wales. The economic transformation of Wales under English rule had demonstrated Edward's capacity for systematic territorial integration when news arrived from Scotland that would present him with an opportunity of far greater magnitude. On March 19th, 1286, Alexander III of Scotland died after his horse stumbled on the coastal cliffs near Kinghorn during a violent storm. The Scottish king's death left the realm without a direct male heir, as his children had predeceased him, creating a succession crisis that would ultimately draw Edward into the most complex legal and political challenge of his reign. Alexander III's death represented the end of a remarkably stable period in Scottish history, during which the kingdom had achieved unprecedented prosperity and territorial consolidation. Under his rule, Scotland had successfully resisted Norwegian claims to the Hebrides, definitively establishing Scottish sovereignty over these strategic islands through the Treaty of Perth in 1266. The Scottish royal administration had developed sophisticated governmental institutions modelled on English and French examples, while Scottish nobles had established extensive landholdings in both Scotland and England that created complex webs of feudal obligation across the Anglo-Scottish border. The immediate succession fell to Alexander's granddaughter Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, who was barely 3 years old and residing in the Norwegian court of her grandfather Eric II. The prospect of a female child ruling Scotland presented unprecedented constitutional challenges, as Scottish law contained no clear precedents for female succession, while the practical difficulties of governing through a regency for an absent minor promised years of political instability and factional conflict. The Scottish magnates who gathered at Scone following Alexander's death recognised the gravity of their situation and moved quickly to establish a regency government that could maintain royal authority during Margaret's minority. The 6 guardians appointed to govern Scotland represented the most powerful noble families in the kingdom: 2 bishops, 2 earls, and 2 barons whose combined influence encompassed virtually all of Scotland's major regions and political factions. The regency arrangement reflected the sophisticated political culture that had developed in 13th century Scotland, where royal authority operated through careful negotiation and consensus building among powerful regional magnates, rather than the more centralised administrative systems that Edward had established in England. The Scottish guardians possessed extensive experience in royal administration and maintained established relationships with English, Norwegian, and continental courts that would prove essential for managing the succession crisis. Edward's initial response to the Scottish succession crisis demonstrated both his genuine desire to maintain peaceful relations with Scotland and his shrewd recognition of the opportunities that Scottish instability might provide for advancing English interests. The English king had maintained cordial relations with Alexander III, whose sister Margaret had been married to Edward's close associate John Comyn, creating family connections that reinforced the diplomatic ties between the 2 kingdoms. The proposal for Margaret's marriage to Edward's son, the future Edward II, emerged from negotiations between English and Scottish representatives during the summer of 1289. This arrangement offered an elegant solution to the succession crisis that would preserve Scottish independence, while creating the possibility of eventual dynastic union between England and Scotland. The marriage treaty negotiated at Birgham in July 1290 specified that Scotland would retain its separate laws, customs and governmental institutions, even if the 2 crowns were eventually united through inheritance. The Birgham negotiations revealed Edward's sophisticated understanding of the legal and political complexities involved in managing relationships between independent kingdoms. The English king insisted on detailed provisions protecting English interests in Scotland, while acknowledging Scottish sovereignty and the rights of Scottish nobles. The treaty created mechanisms for resolving disputes between English and Scottish subjects while maintaining the separate jurisdictions of each kingdom's legal system. The death of Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in September 1290 during her voyage to Scotland transformed a manageable succession crisis into a constitutional catastrophe that would reshape the political landscape of medieval Britain. The 7-year-old queen died on the Orkney Islands, possibly from seasickness or disease contracted during the difficult North Sea crossing, leaving Scotland without any universally acknowledged heir to the throne. Margaret's death created a succession dispute involving multiple claimants whose competing genealogical arguments reflected the complex marriage alliances and inheritance patterns that characterised medieval royal families. The most prominent candidates were John Balliol, Robert Bruce the Elder, and John Hastings, each of whom could present plausible legal arguments based on different principles of inheritance law and varying in interpretations of Scottish constitutional traditions. John Balliol's claim derived from his descent from Dervoguia, daughter of Alan of Galloway and great-granddaughter of David, Earl of Huntingdon, who was brother to William the Lion and grandfather to Alexander II of Scotland. This genealogical connection made Balliol the senior heir according to the principle of primogeniture, as his ancestor represented the senior line of descent from the royal house of Scotland. Robert Bruce the Elder based his claim on his status as the son of Isabella, another daughter of David, Earl of Huntingdon, arguing that his closer degree of relationship to the last undisputed king gave him superior rights, according to the principle of proximity of blood. Bruce's legal position emphasised that inheritance should pass to the claimant with the fewest intervening generations, rather than necessarily following strict primogeniture through female lines. John Hastings presented the most innovative legal argument, claiming that Scotland should be divided among the 3 principal heirs as co-parceners, following the principles that governed the inheritance of baronial estates when multiple female heirs survived. This argument, while legally sophisticated, ignored the fundamental principle that kingdoms, unlike private estates, could not be partitioned among multiple heirs without destroying their essential unity and governmental effectiveness. The complexity of these competing claims created a legal puzzle that required resolution through formal arbitration, rather than the military conflict that might otherwise have determined the succession. The Scottish guardians, recognising their inability to resolve the dispute through internal negotiations, approached Edward in May 1291 to request his arbitration as an impartial external authority with the legal expertise necessary to evaluate the competing genealogical and constitutional arguments. Edward's acceptance of the role of arbitrator represented a calculated decision that would provide him with unprecedented influence over Scottish affairs, while potentially establishing legal precedents for English overlordship that could be invoked in future disputes. The English king's extensive legal education and his experience with complex inheritance disputes in his own territories made him a logical choice for this role, while his family connections to the Scottish royal house provided additional legitimacy for his involvement. The preliminary negotiations that preceded the formal arbitration proceedings revealed Edward's determination to extract maximum advantage from his position as arbitrator. The English king insisted that all claimants must acknowledge his overlordship of Scotland before he would consider their cases, arguing that only the feudal superior of the Scottish kingdom possessed the authority to determine questions of royal succession. The legal theory underlying Edward's claim to overlordship drew upon historical precedents dating back to the Anglo-Saxon period, when Scottish kings had occasionally performed homage to English monarchs during periods of English military dominance. Edward's lawyers compiled extensive documentation of these historical instances, arguing that they established a continuous tradition of English suzerainty over Scotland that had been temporarily suspended during periods of English weakness but retained its fundamental validity. The Scottish response to Edward's overlordship claims revealed the difficult position in which the succession crisis had placed the Scottish political establishment. While Scottish legal traditions contained no acknowledgement of English suzerainty, the practical necessity of resolving the succession dispute through external arbitration made it impossible to reject Edward's demands without risking the collapse of the arbitration process and potential English military intervention. The formal submission of the Scottish claimants to Edward's overlordship took place at Norham Castle in May 1291, where each candidate for the Scottish throne acknowledged Edward as their feudal superior and agreed to accept his judgment regarding their competing claims. This ceremony provided Edward with the legal foundation he would later invoke to justify English intervention in Scottish affairs, while also creating binding obligations for whoever ultimately received the Scottish crown. The arbitration proceedings that followed the Norham submissions demonstrated Edward's commitment to reaching a legally sound decision based on careful evaluation of the evidence rather than simply selecting the candidate most likely to serve English interests. The English king appointed a panel of expert advisors that included leading canon lawyers, civil lawyers trained in Roman law, and specialists in feudal law whose combined expertise could address all aspects of the complex legal questions involved. The procedural arrangements for the arbitration reflected contemporary developments in legal scholarship that emphasized systematic evaluation of evidence and formal rules of argumentation. Each claimant was required to present written statements of their case, supported by genealogical evidence and legal precedents, while Edward's advisors conducted detailed examinations of the historical and legal materials relevant to Scottish succession law. The evidentiary standards applied during the arbitration proceedings required unprecedented documentation of genealogical relationships and legal precedents that had previously been preserved primarily through oral tradition. The systematic compilation of this evidence created comprehensive records of Scottish royal genealogy and constitutional law that would influence legal scholarship for centuries, while also providing Edward with detailed knowledge of Scottish political structures and relationships. The most complex legal issue addressed during the arbitration concerned the relationship between different principles of inheritance law and their application to royal succession. The competing claims required the arbitrators to determine whether Scottish succession should follow the strict primogeniture that favoured Balliol, the proximity of blood argument advanced by Bruce, or the co-parsonry division proposed by Hastings, the final decision announced at Berwick on November 17, 1292, awarded the Scottish throne to John Balliol, based primarily on the principle of primogeniture that had become standard practice in most European kingdoms. Edward's judgment emphasised that royal succession should follow the same legal principles that governed the inheritance of other feudal holdings, with the crown passing to the senior heir, regardless of the specific degree of relationship to the last monarch. The legal reasoning supporting Balliol's selection reflected sophisticated analysis of European succession practices and constitutional theory that demonstrated Edward's genuine commitment to reaching a defensible legal conclusion. The judgment acknowledged the strength of Bruce's proximity argument, while concluding that established precedents from England, France, and other kingdoms supported the primogeniture principle that favoured Balliol's claim. John Balliol's coronation at Scone on November 30, 1292, marked the beginning of a reign that would be dominated by the fundamental contradiction between his obligations as Edward's feudal vassal and his responsibilities as an independent Scottish king. The new monarch had received his throne through English arbitration and acknowledged English overlordship, creating legal obligations that would inevitably conflict with Scottish expectations of royal independence and sovereignty. The early years of Balliol's reign demonstrated the practical difficulties of governing Scotland while maintaining feudal subordination to England. Edward's interpretation of his overlordship rights included the authority to hear appeals from Scottish royal courts, to require Scottish military service for English campaigns, and to intervene in Scottish administrative decisions that affected English interests. These demands created constant tensions between English expectations and Scottish resistance to external interference. The most significant early conflict between Edward and Balliol emerged from a legal appeal brought by Macduff, son of Malcolm, Earl of Fife, who challenged a decision of the Scottish royal court regarding his inheritance rights. Edward's acceptance of this appeal and his reversal of Balliol's judgment established a precedent for English judicial intervention in Scottish affairs that fundamentally undermined Scottish royal authority and legal independence. The Macduff case revealed the broader implications of Edward's overlordship claims for Scottish governance and constitutional autonomy. If English courts could review and reverse decisions of Scottish royal tribunals, then Scottish law became subordinate to English legal authority, effectively reducing Scotland to the status of an English province rather than an independent kingdom under feudal suzerainty. Balliol's response to English judicial interference demonstrated both his personal frustration with his subordinate position and his recognition of the broader Scottish opposition to English overlordship. The Scottish king's attempts to resist English legal appeals while maintaining his feudal obligations to Edward created an impossible situation that satisfied neither English demands for submission nor Scottish expectations of royal independence. The military obligations that Edward imposed on Scotland as part of his overlordship rights created additional tensions that would ultimately precipitate open conflict between the two kingdoms. The English king's demands for Scottish military service in his continental campaigns violated traditional Scottish neutrality in Anglo-French conflicts, while requiring Scottish nobles to fight alongside English forces against potential Scottish allies. The specific military crisis that triggered the final breakdown of Anglo-Scottish relations emerged from Edward's conflict with Philip IV of France over English possessions in Gascony. When Philip declared Edward's French territories forfeit in May 1294 and began military operations to enforce this confiscation, Edward demanded Scottish military assistance as part of Balliol's feudal obligations to his English overlord. The Scottish response to Edward's military demands revealed the extent to which English overlordship had become unacceptable to Scottish political opinion. The Scottish Parliament that convened in July 1295 rejected Edward's demands for military service and instead negotiated a defensive alliance with France that directly challenged English overlordship and created the framework for coordinated Franco-Scottish resistance to English expansion. The Franco-Scottish alliance negotiated in October 1295 represented a fundamental shift in European diplomatic alignments that would influence Anglo-Scottish relations for the next 3 centuries. The treaty provided for mutual military assistance against English aggression, coordinated diplomatic efforts to resist English territorial expansion, and marriage alliances that would strengthen the bonds between the French and Scottish royal houses. The terms of the Franco-Scottish alliance specifically addressed the military coordination necessary for effective resistance to English power. The treaty established procedures for sharing intelligence about English military preparations, coordinating attacks on English territories, and providing mutual support for diplomatic initiatives designed to isolate England within the broader European political system. Edward's reaction to the Franco-Scottish alliance demonstrated his recognition that Scottish independence had become incompatible with English security interests, and his determination to resolve the Scottish problem through military conquest rather than continued feudal negotiation. The English king's preparations for war against Scotland involved mobilisation on a scale that exceeded even his Welsh campaigns, reflecting his understanding that the conquest of Scotland would require sustained military effort over several years. The military preparations for the Scottish campaign revealed the administrative and logistical capabilities that Edward's governmental reforms had created during the previous 2 decades. Royal officials throughout England received detailed instructions for raising troops, collecting supplies, and coordinating transportation arrangements that would support large-scale military operations in Scotland. The systematic nature of these preparations demonstrated Edward's intention to achieve decisive results that would permanently resolve the Scottish question. The diplomatic initiatives that preceded Edward's military intervention in Scotland reflected his determination to justify English aggression through legal arguments that would satisfy contemporary European opinion. English envoys to continental courts emphasised Balliol's violation of his feudal obligations and his treasonous alliance with France, arguing that Edward's military response constituted legitimate enforcement of established legal relationships rather than unprovoked aggression against an independent kingdom. The legal justification for English military intervention drew upon the precedents established during the Great Cause arbitration and the subsequent feudal relationship between Edward and Balliol. English lawyers argued that Balliol's alliance with France constituted a fundamental breach of his feudal obligations that justified the forfeiture of his kingdom and its reversion to Edward as feudal superior. The mobilisation of English forces for the Scottish campaign demonstrated Edward's commitment to achieving rapid and decisive victory that would prevent the development of prolonged resistance similar to his experiences in Wales. The English army that assembled at Newcastle in March 1296 included approximately 25,000 infantry and 5,000 heavy cavalry, supported by substantial numbers of Welsh longbowmen whose effectiveness had been demonstrated during the Welsh Wars. The composition of Edward's Scottish invasion force reflected his systematic approach to military organisation and his understanding of the specific challenges that Scottish terrain and tactics would present. The inclusion of experienced Welsh troops provided expertise in mountain warfare and irregular tactics, while the substantial cavalry contingent was designed to achieve rapid territorial conquest through mobility and shock action. The siege train that accompanied Edward's army included the most advanced military engineering equipment available in late 13th century Europe, reflecting the king's determination to reduce Scottish fortifications quickly and prevent the kind of prolonged siege warfare that might allow Scottish resistance to consolidate. The presence of Master James of St. George and other experienced siege specialists indicated Edward's intention to apply the lessons learned during his Welsh castle building programme to the conquest of Scotland. The opening of the Scottish campaign with the assault on Berwick in March 1296 demonstrated both the effectiveness of Edward's military preparations and his determination to employ maximum force to achieve rapid Scottish submission. The English attack on Scotland's principal commercial centre was designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance while eliminating the economic resources that might sustain prolonged Scottish opposition to English rule. The sack of Berwick on March 30th, 1296, established the brutal tone that would characterise Edward's Scottish campaigns and demonstrate his willingness to employ unprecedented violence to achieve political objectives. The assault began at dawn with a coordinated attack by English infantry against the town's wooden palisades, while cavalry units positioned themselves to prevent any escape by the defenders. Edward personally led the initial charge, wielding a battle-axe as his forces breached the inadequate fortifications that had protected Scotland's wealthiest commercial centre. The systematic massacre that followed Berwick's capture exceeded even contemporary standards for siege warfare brutality. English soldiers methodically slaughtered virtually the entire population, sparing neither women nor children in their determination to make an example that would terrorise other Scottish towns into immediate submission. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that the killing continued for 3 days, with English forces showing particular savagery toward Flemish merchants whose commercial activities had made Berwick prosperous, and whose foreign origins marked them as especially suitable targets for English fury. The economic destruction accompanying the human slaughter eliminated Berwick's position as Scotland's premier trading centre and demonstrated Edward's understanding that commercial prosperity provided the foundation for Scottish resistance capabilities. English forces systematically destroyed warehouses filled with wool, hides, and other Scottish exports, while also burning the ships that connected Scottish merchants to continental markets. The deliberate targeting of economic infrastructure revealed Edward's strategic comprehension that Scottish independence depended upon the commercial revenues that funded military resistance. The psychological impact of Berwick's destruction reverberated throughout Scotland as refugees spread accounts of English brutality that far exceeded anything experienced during previous Anglo-Scottish conflicts. The systematic nature of the massacre, combined with Edward's personal participation in the killing, signalled that the English king intended to wage total war against Scottish independence, rather than the limited feudal conflicts that had previously characterised cross-border disputes. Edward's treatment of Berwick survivors demonstrated his calculated use of terror as a military weapon designed to break Scottish morale and encourage submission without further resistance. The few hundred inhabitants who escaped the initial massacre were herded into the town's churches, which were then set ablaze, creating scenes of horror that English soldiers were specifically instructed to describe in detail when encountering other Scottish communities. This deliberate propagation of atrocity accounts represented a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign that anticipated modern concepts of terror bombing and civilian targeting. The immediate aftermath of Berwick's fall saw the rapid collapse of Scottish resistance throughout the southeastern counties, as news of English brutality convinced local nobles and town officials that submission offered the only hope for survival. The Earl of March abandoned his castle at Dunbar without attempting resistance, while lesser nobles throughout the Borders region sent envoys to Edward offering immediate surrender and acknowledgement of English overlordship. The Battle of Dunbar on April 27, 1296, provided Edward with the decisive military victory that completed the destruction of organised Scottish resistance and demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of English military organisation over traditional Scottish feudal levies. The Scottish army that assembled to confront Edward's advance included virtually every major noble family in Scotland, representing the last coordinated effort to preserve Scottish independence through conventional military means. The Scottish forces at Dunbar reflected the aristocratic military culture that had developed during the peaceful decades of Alexander III's reign, when Scottish nobles had gained experience primarily through tournaments and ceremonial displays rather than serious warfare. The Scottish cavalry consisted mainly of heavily armoured knights fighting in the French style, while their infantry included substantial numbers of poorly equipped peasant levies whose military value was questionable against professional English soldiers. John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, commanded the Scottish forces with tactical concepts derived from continental warfare that proved completely inappropriate for confronting Edward's systematically organised army. The Scottish battle plan called for a traditional cavalry charge against the English centre, followed by infantry advances designed to exploit any breakthrough achieved by the mounted knights. This conventional approach ignored the tactical innovations that Edward had developed during his Welsh campaigns and the superior discipline that characterised English professional soldiers. Edward's tactical deployment at Dunbar demonstrated the military lessons he had absorbed during 2 decades of warfare against Celtic opponents and continental enemies. The English army formed up in 3 divisions, with heavy cavalry concentrated on the flanks while infantry occupied the centre in dense formations protected by stakes and crossbow units. This arrangement provided multiple layers of defence against Scottish cavalry charges while maintaining offensive capabilities that could exploit any Scottish tactical mistakes. The opening phase of the battle saw Scottish cavalry charges repeatedly shattered against English defensive formations that had been specifically designed to counter mounted attacks. The English infantry maintained their positions despite heavy Scottish pressure, while crossbow units inflicted severe casualties on Scottish knights whose armour provided inadequate protection against mechanical weapons fired at close range. The systematic destruction of Scottish cavalry eliminated the most effective component of the Scottish army and left their infantry formations vulnerable to English counterattacks. The decisive moment of the battle occurred when Edward ordered his heavy cavalry to advance against the disorganised Scottish infantry, whose formation had been disrupted by the failure of their own cavalry charges. The English mounted attack achieved complete tactical surprise and transformed Scottish retreat into catastrophic rout that eliminated organised Scottish resistance throughout the eastern lowlands. The systematic pursuit that followed the main battle resulted in the capture or death of most prominent Scottish nobles, effectively decapitating the Scottish political establishment. The casualties inflicted during the Battle of Dunbar included virtually the entire Scottish military leadership, with 3 earls killed in the fighting and dozens of lesser nobles captured during the pursuit. The Earl of Atholl, the Earl of Menteith, and numerous other prominent figures died attempting to rally their broken forces, while John Comyn and other survivors were taken prisoner and transported to English castles where they would remain until ransomed or executed according to Edward's political calculations. The immediate aftermath of Dunbar saw the collapse of Scottish resistance throughout the kingdom, as news of the military disaster convinced remaining Scottish nobles that continued opposition was futile. Edinburgh Castle surrendered without siege, while Roxburgh, Jedburgh and other strategic fortifications were abandoned by their garrisons before English forces could arrive to invest them. The rapid succession of surrenders demonstrated that Scottish morale had been completely shattered by the combination of Berwick's destruction and Dunbar's military catastrophe. Edward's advance through Scotland following his victory at Dunbar resembled a triumphal procession rather than a military campaign, as Scottish towns and castles submitted without resistance to avoid the fate that had befallen Berwick. The English king's progress northward was marked by elaborate ceremonies of submission, where Scottish nobles and ecclesiastical leaders acknowledged English overlordship while surrendering the symbols of their former independence. The capture of Edinburgh in June 1296 provided Edward with control over Scotland's administrative centre and access to the records and regalia that symbolised Scottish royal authority. The English occupation of Edinburgh Castle eliminated the last significant Scottish stronghold south of the Forth, while also providing Edward with documentary evidence of Scottish governmental structures and noble relationships that would prove essential for establishing permanent English control over Scotland. The systematic removal of Scottish royal regalia and governmental records from Edinburgh Castle represented Edward's understanding that effective conquest required the elimination of symbols and institutions that might serve as focal points for future resistance movements. English officials carefully catalogued and removed all items associated with Scottish royal authority, including charters, seals, and ceremonial objects that had legitimised Scottish independence for centuries. The most symbolically significant seizure occurred when Edward's forces removed the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey, where it had served as the coronation seat for Scottish kings since time immemorial. The ancient sandstone block, measuring approximately 26 inches long and 16 inches wide, represented the mystical connection between Scottish kingship and the land itself, embodying traditions that predated Christianity and linked Scottish royal authority to prehistoric Celtic religious practices. The Stone of Destiny's historical significance extended far beyond its ceremonial function, as Scottish legal and religious traditions attributed supernatural powers to the ancient relic that supposedly guaranteed the legitimacy of any king crowned upon it. The stone's legendary origins connected it to biblical patriarchs and Irish Celtic mythology, creating a complex web of religious and cultural meanings that made its possession essential for any claimant to Scottish royal authority. Edward's decision to transport the Stone of Destiny to Westminster Abbey represented a calculated act of symbolic warfare designed to demonstrate that Scottish kingship had been permanently transferred to English control. The stone's installation beneath the English coronation chair created a visible reminder that future English kings would literally sit upon the foundation of Scottish royal authority, symbolically crushing Scottish independence beneath English royal power. The practical arrangements for transporting the Stone of Destiny from Scone to Westminster required careful planning and substantial resources, as the ancient relic weighed approximately 336 pounds and needed protection during the dangerous journey through potentially hostile Scottish territory. Edward assigned a special military escort to guard the stone during its removal, while also ensuring that the transfer occurred with maximum publicity to demonstrate Scottish submission throughout the kingdom. The religious ceremonies that accompanied the stone's removal from Scone Abbey reflected Edward's understanding that Scottish resistance drew strength from spiritual as well as political sources. English bishops conducted elaborate rituals designed to transfer the stone's supposed supernatural powers from Scottish to English royal authority, while also demonstrating that the Scottish Church had submitted to English ecclesiastical control. The installation of the Stone of Destiny in Westminster Abbey was accompanied by extensive modifications to the existing coronation chair that would accommodate the Scottish relic while emphasising its subordinate status to English royal authority. The wooden chair constructed to house the stone featured carved decorations that celebrated Edward's conquest of Scotland, while positioning the ancient Scottish symbol as a footstool for English kings. The broader programme of symbolic warfare that accompanied Edward's conquest of Scotland involved the systematic removal or destruction of other objects and institutions that embodied Scottish national identity. English forces seized the Black Rood of Scotland, a fragment of the True Cross that had served as the most sacred relic of Scottish Christianity, along with numerous other religious artefacts that connected Scottish identity to broader Christian traditions. The destruction of Scottish governmental records represented another crucial component of Edward's symbolic warfare campaign, as these documents provided legal foundations for Scottish independence and noble privileges that might support future resistance movements. English officials systematically collected and destroyed charters, legal codes, and administrative records that had legitimised Scottish royal authority and defined the relationships between Scottish kings and their subjects. The removal of John Balliol's royal regalia completed the symbolic destruction of Scottish kingship and demonstrated that Edward's conquest extended beyond mere military occupation to encompass the complete elimination of Scottish political institutions. The crown, sceptre, and other ceremonial objects that had symbolised Balliol's royal authority were transported to England along with the Stone of Destiny, creating a comprehensive collection of Scottish royal symbols that would remain in English custody for centuries. Edward's treatment of the deposed John Balliol reflected his determination to humiliate Scottish kingship, while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to English authority. Balliol was stripped of his royal insignia in a public ceremony at Montrose that deliberately reversed the rituals of coronation, with English officials removing each symbol of royal authority while proclaiming that Scottish kingship had been forfeited through treason and rebellion. The public humiliation inflicted upon Balliol included the removal of his royal coat of arms from his surcoat, an act that earned him the derogatory nickname Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat, signifying that he had been stripped of all symbols of royal dignity and authority. This ceremonial degradation was witnessed by Scottish nobles and clergy who were required to acknowledge that their former king had been reduced to the status of a common prisoner through his rebellion against English overlordship. The imprisonment of John Balliol in the Tower of London eliminated any possibility that the deposed Scottish king might serve as a focal point for future resistance movements, while also providing Edward with a valuable hostage whose fate could influence Scottish political calculations. Balliol's comfortable but secure confinement demonstrated Edward's willingness to treat defeated enemies with relative clemency, provided they acknowledged English supremacy and abandoned any claims to independent authority. The administrative arrangements Edward established for governing conquered Scotland reflected his determination to integrate Scottish territories permanently into the English governmental system, rather than merely extracting tribute or acknowledgement of overlordship. The appointment of English officials to key administrative positions throughout Scotland eliminated Scottish control over taxation, justice, and military organisation, while ensuring that Scottish resources would serve English rather than Scottish interests. John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, received appointment as Edward's lieutenant in Scotland, with comprehensive authority over military and civil administration throughout the conquered kingdom. Whilst Warenne's extensive experience in English territorial administration and his demonstrated loyalty to Edward made him an obvious choice for this crucial position, though his unfamiliarity with Scottish conditions and his contemptuous attitude towards Scottish customs would eventually contribute to the resurgence of Scottish resistance. Hugh de Cressingham's appointment as Treasurer of Scotland represented Edward's determination to extract maximum financial benefit from his Scottish conquest while establishing administrative systems that would support permanent English control. Cressingham possessed extensive experience in royal financial administration and had demonstrated exceptional skill in maximising revenues from conquered territories during Edward's Welsh campaigns. The taxation policies implemented by Cressingham and other English administrators in Scotland generated substantial revenues for Edward's treasury, while also creating widespread resentment among Scottish populations who found themselves subject to unprecedented financial demands. The systematic assessment and collection of taxes according to English administrative procedures eliminated traditional Scottish exemptions and privileges while imposing new obligations that far exceeded previous Scottish royal taxation. The establishment of English garrisons in strategic Scottish castles provided the military foundation for permanent English control, while also demonstrating Edward's understanding that successful conquest required sustained military presence rather than merely temporary occupation. The garrison commanders received detailed instructions for maintaining English authority, while also gathering intelligence about potential resistance activities and Scottish political developments. The apparent completeness of Edward's Scottish conquest by the autumn of 1296 seemed to vindicate his systematic approach to territorial integration and symbolic warfare. Scottish resistance had been crushed through overwhelming military force. Scottish political institutions had been eliminated through systematic destruction of symbols and records, and Scottish administrative systems had been replaced by English governmental structures that ensured permanent subordination to English authority. However, the very thoroughness of Edward's conquest contained the seeds of future resistance, as the systematic humiliation of Scottish national identity and the harsh treatment of Scottish populations created grievances that would eventually find expression in new forms of resistance that English administrative and military systems proved unable to contain. The elimination of traditional Scottish leadership created space for new leaders who would emerge from previously obscure backgrounds to challenge English rule through innovative tactics and appeals to Scottish national sentiment. The first signs of renewed Scottish resistance appeared in the spring of 1297 when William Wallace, a minor noble from Renfrewshire, began organising attacks against English administrative personnel and tax collectors throughout southwestern Scotland. Wallace's background differed dramatically from the great nobles who had led previous Scottish resistance, as he possessed neither extensive landholdings nor established political connections that might have made him a natural leader of anti-English activities. Wallace's emergence as a resistance leader reflected the social and political changes that Edward's conquest had created in Scottish society. The elimination or exile of traditional Scottish nobles had created a leadership vacuum that could only be filled by individuals willing to risk everything in opposition to English rule. While the harsh treatment of Scottish populations had generated widespread support for anyone capable of organising effective resistance against English oppression. The initial attacks organised by Wallace and his associates targeted the English administrative apparatus that had been established to govern conquered Scotland, focusing particularly on tax collectors and judicial officials whose activities most directly affected ordinary Scottish populations. These attacks demonstrated sophisticated planning and local knowledge that suggested Wallace possessed broader support networks than English authorities initially recognised. The Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, transformed Wallace from a local resistance leader into a national hero whose victory demonstrated that English military superiority was not insurmountable when confronted by innovative tactics and determined Scottish resistance. The battle occurred when Wallace and Andrew Murray, who had organised parallel resistance activities in northern Scotland, combined their forces to confront an English army commanded by John de Warenne and Hugh de Cressingham. The tactical situation at Stirling Bridge provided Wallace with opportunities to exploit English overconfidence and tactical rigidity that had characterised previous English victories over Scottish forces. The narrow bridge across the River Forth created a bottleneck that prevented the English from utilising their numerical superiority, while the marshy ground on the northern bank limited the effectiveness of English heavy cavalry. Wallace's battle plan demonstrated remarkable tactical sophistication for a commander with limited formal military experience, as he recognised that English forces would be most vulnerable during their crossing of the narrow bridge, when their formations would be disrupted and their retreat routes potentially compromised. The Scottish forces concealed themselves in the surrounding woodlands until approximately half the English army had crossed the bridge, then launched a coordinated attack that trapped the English vanguard on the northern bank while preventing reinforcements from crossing to their assistance. The destruction of the English vanguard at Stirling Bridge included the death of Hugh de Cressingham, whose unpopular taxation policies had made him a particular target of Scottish hatred. Contemporary accounts describe how Scottish soldiers flayed Cressingham's corpse and distributed pieces of his skin as trophies, demonstrating the intensity of Scottish resentment against English administrative oppression and the personal nature of the conflict that Edward's policies had created. The tactical innovations that Wallace employed at Stirling Bridge included the effective use of schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen that could resist cavalry charges while maintaining offensive capabilities against disrupted enemy formations. These tactical concepts drew upon Swiss and Flemish military innovations that Wallace had apparently studied, suggesting that Scottish resistance possessed sophisticated understanding of contemporary European military developments. The strategic implications of Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge extended far beyond the immediate military consequences, as the defeat demonstrated that English control over Scotland remained fundamentally unstable despite the apparent completeness of Edward's conquest. The battle's outcome encouraged Scottish resistance throughout the kingdom, while also attracting international attention that would eventually result in renewed French support for Scottish independence. Edward's response to the Stirling Bridge disaster revealed both his personal fury at this unexpected reversal and his recognition that Scottish resistance required more systematic suppression than his previous policies had achieved. the English king immediately began preparations for a new Scottish campaign that would involve larger forces and more brutal tactics designed to eliminate Scottish resistance permanently rather than merely achieving temporary submission. The military preparations for Edward's return to Scotland involved the mobilisation of the largest English army assembled during the 13th century, reflecting the king's determination to achieve decisive results that would prevent any future Scottish challenges to English authority. The forces that assembled at York during the winter of 1297 to 1298 included approximately 30,000 infantry and 7,500 heavy cavalry, supported by substantial numbers of Welsh longbowmen and Gascon crossbowmen, whose specialised skills had proven effective during previous campaigns. The Battle of Falkirk on July 22, 1298, provided Edward with the opportunity to demonstrate the tactical innovations and military reforms that his previous defeats had inspired, while also revealing the fundamental limitations of Scottish resistance when confronted by systematically organised English forces employing coordinated combined arms tactics. Wallace's defensive position at Falkirk reflected his understanding that Scottish forces could not match English military capabilities in open battle, requiring tactical arrangements that would maximise Scottish advantages while minimising English strengths. The Scottish army formed up in 4 large schiltrons positioned on rising ground that provided natural defensive advantages while maintaining communications between the separate formations. The schiltron formations that Wallace employed at Falkirk represented the most sophisticated Scottish military innovation of the medieval period, creating dense masses of spearmen surrounded by protective barriers of stakes and ropes that could resist cavalry charges, while providing platforms for crossbow and archery fire. These tactical concepts required extensive training and discipline that demonstrated the organisational capabilities Wallace had developed during his months of resistance activities. Edward's tactical response to the Scottish schiltrons demonstrated the combined arms innovations that had emerged from his experiences in Wales and Gascony, particularly the coordinated use of longbowmen and heavy cavalry that would characterise English military superiority for the next century. The English battle plan called for systematic archery bombardment of the Scottish formations, followed by coordinated cavalry charges designed to exploit any weaknesses created by missile fire. The English longbowmen who participated in the Falkirk campaign represented the culmination of military developments that had begun during Edward's Welsh Wars, when English commanders had recognised the devastating effectiveness of massed archery fire against dense infantry formations. The longbow's range and penetrating power provided English forces with decisive advantages over Scottish crossbows and traditional archery, while the rapid rate of fire achievable by experienced archers created unprecedented volumes of missile fire that could disrupt enemy formations before they could close to effective combat range. The coordination between English archery and cavalry units at Falkirk demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded anything previously achieved in medieval warfare, as Edward's commanders successfully integrated different types of military units into mutually supporting formations that maximised their combined effectiveness. The systematic archery bombardment that opened the battle created gaps in Scottish schiltron formations that English cavalry could exploit, while the cavalry charges prevented Scottish forces from advancing against the English archers. The collapse of Scottish resistance at Falkirk occurred when sustained. English archery fire disrupted the schiltron formations sufficiently to allow English cavalry to penetrate Scottish defensive lines and transform organised resistance into chaotic rout. The systematic destruction of Wallace's army eliminated organised Scottish resistance for several years, while also demonstrating that English tactical innovations had restored English military superiority over Scottish forces. The systematic destruction of Wallace's army at Falkirk marked not only a military triumph, but also a crucial juncture in Edward's understanding of governance itself. The resources required for his Scottish campaigns had strained royal finances beyond anything experienced during his Welsh conquests, forcing the king to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between royal authority and the consent of his subjects. The traditional feudal obligations that had sustained earlier military campaigns proved insufficient for the sustained warfare that Scottish resistance demanded, compelling Edward to develop new mechanisms for extracting revenue and military service from his realm. The financial crisis that emerged from Edward's Scottish campaigns revealed the limitations of traditional royal revenue sources in supporting the expanded governmental activities that territorial conquest required. The royal domain lands, customs duties and feudal obligations that had adequately funded Henry III's more limited governmental activities could not sustain the massive military expenditures, castle construction programs, and administrative expansion that Edward's imperial ambitions demanded. The king's household accounts from this period show expenditures that consistently exceeded traditional revenues by substantial margins, creating a structural deficit that required innovative solutions. Edward's response to this financial crisis involved the systematic development of new taxation methods that would fundamentally alter the relationship between English kings and their subjects. Rather than relying solely on feudal obligations or extraordinary levies imposed during specific emergencies, Edward began implementing regular taxation that treated all subjects as contributors to royal revenues, regardless of their feudal status or traditional exemptions. This approach required new legal theories that could justify taxation beyond the customary limits that had previously constrained royal financial demands. The legal justification for expanded royal taxation drew upon Roman law concepts of sovereignty that Edward's continental experiences had exposed him to, particularly the principle that royal authority encompassed inherent rights to command resources necessary for the common defence of the realm. English lawyers trained in canon law and civil law provided theoretical frameworks that could support systematic taxation while addressing the practical objections that such policies would inevitably generate among English landholders and urban communities. The practical implementation of expanded taxation required administrative innovations that would transform the structure and operation of English government throughout the remainder of the medieval period. The assessment and collection of new taxes demanded detailed surveys of wealth and property that exceeded even the comprehensive investigations Edward had conducted during his early administrative reforms. Royal officials developed standardized procedures for evaluating taxable resources, while also creating enforcement mechanisms that could compel compliance from reluctant taxpayers. The resistance that Edward's taxation policies generated among English nobles and urban communities forced the king to confront constitutional questions about the limits of royal authority and the rights of subjects to participate in decisions affecting their financial obligations. The traditional assumption that kings could impose taxation during emergencies without formal consultation had become untenable when taxation became regular and systematic rather than occasional and limited. English political traditions contained precedents for consultation between kings and their subjects, but these had typically involved informal negotiations rather than formal institutional arrangements. The evolution of Parliament during Edward's reign represented his pragmatic response to the political necessity of obtaining consent for expanded taxation, while maintaining royal control over policy decisions and administrative implementation. The king's early parliaments bore little resemblance to the representative institution that would eventually emerge, functioning primarily as enlarged royal councils, where the king could present his policies to assembled nobles and ecclesiastical leaders, while soliciting their advice and consent for specific measures. The composition of Edward's early parliaments reflected his understanding that effective governance required the participation of different social groups, whose cooperation was essential for implementing royal policies. The great nobles and ecclesiastical hierarchy, who had traditionally participated in royal councils, were joined by representatives of the lesser nobility, urban communities, and even rural populations, whose resources and services had become crucial for sustaining Edward's expanded governmental activities. The procedural arrangements that governed Edward's parliaments demonstrated his determination to maintain royal control over these assemblies while utilising their consultative functions to legitimise his policies and facilitate their implementation. The king retained exclusive authority to summon Parliament, determine its agenda and dissolve it according to his political calculations, while parliamentary participants possessed advisory rather than legislative powers. These arrangements ensured that Parliament would serve royal interests rather than becoming an independent source of political authority that might challenge royal prerogatives. The Model Parliament of 1295 represented the culmination of Edward's parliamentary experimentation and established institutional precedents that would influence English constitutional development for centuries. The assembly that convened at Westminster in November 1295 included not only the traditional participants in royal councils, but also elected representatives from counties and boroughs whose presence acknowledged the political importance of groups that had previously been excluded from formal governmental participation. The electoral arrangements that produced representatives for the Model Parliament reflected Edward's systematic approach to ensuring that all significant social and economic interests would be represented in his expanded royal council. The county representatives were elected by the community of the shire in assemblies that included all free landholders possessing property above specified minimum values, while borough representatives were chosen according to local customs that varied considerably among different urban communities. These electoral procedures created mechanisms for popular participation in royal government that had no precedence in English constitutional tradition. The social composition of the Model Parliament demonstrated the extent to which English society had become more complex and differentiated during the 13th century, requiring new institutional arrangements that could accommodate interests and perspectives that traditional feudal structures could not adequately represent. The assembly included great nobles whose territorial power and military resources made them indispensable for royal policy implementation, ecclesiastical leaders whose spiritual authority and administrative expertise provided essential governmental services, knights whose local knowledge and military skills were crucial for maintaining royal authority throughout the realm, and urban representatives whose commercial expertise and financial resources had become essential for royal revenues. The procedural innovations that Edward introduced during the Model Parliament established institutional mechanisms that would govern parliamentary operations throughout the medieval period and beyond. The assembly conducted its business according to formal rules that specified procedures for presenting petitions, debating royal proposals, and reaching decisions about taxation and legislation. These procedural arrangements ensured orderly conduct while also providing opportunities for participants to express their views and influence royal policy decisions. The most significant constitutional innovation of the Model Parliament involved the formal acknowledgement that certain types of royal actions required parliamentary consent rather than merely royal decree. The principle that extraordinary taxation required the agreement of those who would pay such taxes had emerged from practical political necessity during Edward's financial crises, but the Model Parliament transformed this pragmatic arrangement into a constitutional principle that would constrain royal authority and protect subject rights throughout subsequent centuries. The taxation arrangements negotiated during the Model Parliament demonstrated the complex bargaining process that had developed between Edward and his subjects over financial obligations and governmental services. The parliamentary representatives agreed to provide substantial revenues for the King's Scottish campaigns in exchange for royal commitments to respect traditional rights and privileges, while also addressing specific grievances about administrative abuses and judicial corruption. These negotiations established precedents for the contractual relationship between rulers and subjects that would become fundamental to English constitutional theory. The legal precedents established during the Model Parliament extended beyond taxation questions to encompass broader issues about the relationship between royal authority and subject rights. the Assembly addressed numerous petitions concerning administrative abuses, judicial corruption, and violations of traditional privileges, creating mechanisms for subjects to seek redress for governmental misconduct, while also establishing procedures for preventing future abuses. These arrangements acknowledged that royal authority was subject to legal limitations, and that subjects possessed rights that even kings could not arbitrarily violate. The ecclesiastical participation in the model parliament reflected the complex relationship between royal and clerical authority that had developed during Edward's reign. The bishops and abbots who attended parliament brought not only their spiritual authority, but also their extensive landholdings, administrative expertise, and international connections that made them crucial participants in royal government. However, their participation also created potential conflicts between royal demands and ecclesiastical privileges that required careful negotiation to prevent constitutional crises. The urban representation in the model parliament acknowledged the growing economic and political importance of English towns and cities whose commercial activities provided increasing proportions of royal revenues through customs duties and taxation. The burgesses who attended Parliament brought practical knowledge of trade, manufacturing and urban administration that royal officials needed for effective policy implementation, while also representing communities whose cooperation was essential for maintaining domestic stability and economic prosperity. The county representatives in the model Parliament provided crucial links between royal government and local administration throughout England, as these knights and lesser nobles possessed the local knowledge and established relationships necessary for implementing royal policies at the grassroots level. Their participation in Parliament created mechanisms for communicating royal decisions to local communities, while also providing channels for local grievances and concerns to reach royal attention. The legislative activities of the model Parliament established precedents for parliamentary participation in lawmaking that would eventually transform English governmental structures and constitutional principles. While Edward retained primary authority for initiating legislation, the parliamentary representatives gained opportunities to influence the content and implementation of royal statutes, while also presenting their own proposals for legal reforms and administrative improvements. These arrangements created collaborative relationships between royal and parliamentary authority that would gradually evolve into more formal power-sharing arrangements. The Statute of Winchester, enacted following consultations with the model Parliament, demonstrated how parliamentary participation could improve the quality and effectiveness of royal legislation, while also ensuring broader support for policy implementation. The statute addressed public order issues that had been raised by parliamentary representatives, establishing comprehensive arrangements for maintaining peace and security throughout England, while also creating new obligations for local communities to participate in law enforcement activities. The military provisions of the Statute of Winchester reflected the lessons Edward had learned during his Welsh and Scottish campaigns about the importance of local cooperation for maintaining royal authority and territorial security. The statute required all free men to possess weapons appropriate to their social status and economic resources, while also establishing procedures for organising local militias that could respond to external threats or internal disorders. These arrangements created military obligations that extended beyond traditional feudal service, while also providing mechanisms for popular participation in territorial defence. The law enforcement provisions of the Statute of Winchester established systematic procedures for investigating crimes, apprehending suspects, and maintaining public order that required cooperation between royal officials and local communities. The statute created new obligations for communities to pursue criminals and compensate victims of violent crimes, while also establishing penalties for communities that failed to fulfill their law enforcement responsibilities. These arrangements strengthened royal authority, while also acknowledging that effective governance required active participation by local populations. The commercial regulations included in the Statute of Winchester address concerns raised by urban representatives in Parliament about trade disruptions, market regulations, and currency standards that affected economic prosperity throughout England. The statute established uniform standards for weights and measures, while also creating enforcement mechanisms that could prevent fraud and ensure fair dealing in commercial transactions. These provisions demonstrated how parliamentary consultation could improve royal understanding of economic conditions and policy needs. The judicial reforms that emerged from Edward's parliamentary consultations addressed systematic problems in the administration of royal justice that had been identified through petitions and complaints presented during parliamentary sessions. The reforms established new procedures for appealing judicial decisions, created mechanisms for investigating judicial corruption, and specified penalties for officials who abused their authority or violated established legal procedures. These changes strengthened royal justice while also protecting subjects against arbitrary governmental action. The development of common law during Edward's reign reflected the collaborative relationship between royal and parliamentary authority that had emerged from constitutional negotiations over taxation and governance. Parliamentary representatives contributed local knowledge and practical experience that helped royal lawyers develop legal principles and procedures that could address the diverse conditions and customs found throughout England. This collaborative approach produced legal innovations that combined royal authority with popular consent in ways that strengthened both governmental effectiveness and constitutional legitimacy. The relationship between royal prerogative and parliamentary consent that developed during Edward's reign established constitutional principles that would govern English politics throughout the medieval period and beyond. While Edward maintained his authority to make policy decisions and direct governmental operations, he acknowledged that certain types of actions required parliamentary approval, and that subjects possessed rights that even royal authority could not arbitrarily override. These arrangements created a balanced constitutional system that protected both royal authority and subject rights. The financial innovations that emerged from Edward's parliamentary negotiations transformed English governmental structures and established precedents for the relationship between taxation and representation that would influence constitutional development throughout subsequent centuries. The principle that extraordinary taxation required parliamentary consent created mechanisms for popular participation in governmental decision-making while also ensuring that royal policies would receive the support necessary for effective implementation. The administrative changes that accompanied Edward's parliamentary developments created new governmental institutions and procedures that could accommodate the expanded role of representative assemblies in English politics. Royal officials developed specialised expertise in managing parliamentary sessions, processing petitions, and implementing legislation that had been negotiated through parliamentary consultation. These administrative innovations ensured that parliamentary participation would enhance rather than obstruct governmental effectiveness. The international implications of Edward's parliamentary innovations attracted attention from continental observers, who recognised that English constitutional developments represented significant departures from traditional European governmental practices. Yet these domestic achievements would soon be overshadowed by the complex web of continental obligations that Edward had inherited with the English crown. The Duchy of Gascony, that last substantial remnant of the once mighty Angevin Empire, remained a persistent source of friction with the French monarchy, while simultaneously providing England with crucial commercial revenues and strategic depth in southwestern Europe. The wine trade that connected Gascon vineyards to English markets generated substantial customs revenues for Edward's treasury, but the duchy's feudal relationship to the French crown created ongoing jurisdictional disputes that threatened to escalate into full-scale warfare. Philip IV of France, who had ascended to the throne in 1285, possessed both the ambition and administrative capabilities necessary to challenge English territorial holdings in ways that his predecessors had been unable to achieve. The French king's systematic approach to expanding royal authority throughout France brought him into inevitable conflict with Edward's position as Duke of Gascony, where English administrative practices and legal traditions had created governmental structures that operated independently of French royal control. Philip's lawyers argued that Edward's ducal authority derived entirely from French royal grant and remained subject to French judicial oversight, while English legal experts countered that Gascon autonomy had been established through centuries of independent development, that French interference could not legitimately override. The specific legal disputes that precipitated the Gascon crisis emerged from Edward's efforts to strengthen English administrative control over the duchy through the appointment of English officials to key positions and the implementation of legal procedures that followed English rather than French models. The Gascon nobility, many of whom held lands on both sides of the Franco-English border, found themselves caught between competing legal systems and conflicting feudal obligations that made neutral positions increasingly difficult to maintain. The appeals that Gascon nobles began presenting to French royal courts represented direct challenges to English ducal authority, while also providing Philip IV with legal justifications for intervening in Gascon affairs. The naval incident that occurred off the coast of Normandy in May 1293 transformed these underlying legal tensions into immediate military confrontation when English and French ships clashed during what had initially been a commercial dispute over fishing rights. The English fleet, commanded by Edward's Admiral Jean Bottetour, included substantial numbers of vessels from the Cinque Ports, whose crews possessed extensive experience in channel warfare and little patience for French challenges to their traditional fishing grounds. The French ships involved in the confrontation were primarily Norman vessels, whose captains claimed exclusive rights to fishing areas that English sailors had utilised for generations. The escalation of this maritime dispute into a major naval battle demonstrated the volatile nature of Anglo-French relations and the ease with which commercial conflicts could develop into military confrontations with broader political implications. The English victory in the naval engagement, achieved through superior seamanship and the coordinated tactics that Cinque Ports sailors had perfected during decades of cross-channel warfare, resulted in the capture of numerous French vessels and the deaths of several prominent Norman nobles. The systematic destruction of French shipping capabilities in the Channel provided England with temporary naval supremacy, but also guaranteed French retaliation that would escalate the conflict beyond maritime boundaries. Philip IV's response to the naval defeat revealed both his determination to assert French royal authority over all territories that owed feudal allegiance to the French crown, and his sophisticated understanding of the legal mechanisms that could be employed to achieve territorial expansion without appearing to violate established feudal relationships. Rather than immediately declaring war against England, Philip summoned Edward to appear before the French royal court as Duke of Gascony to answer charges related to the naval incident and other alleged violations of his feudal obligations. This legal strategy placed Edward in an impossible position, as compliance with the summons would acknowledge French judicial authority over English royal actions, while refusal would provide Philip with legal justification for declaring Edward's French territories forfeit. The diplomatic negotiations that preceded Philip's formal summons revealed a complex network of family relationships, territorial interests, and political calculations that influenced European international relations during the late 13th century. Edward's marriage to Eleanor of Castile had created connections with Iberian royal houses that might provide military support against French expansion, while Philip's recent marriage alliances with various German princes offered opportunities for coordinated pressure against English continental interests. The papal court, traditionally a mediating influence in European conflicts, found itself unable to provide effective arbitration due to ongoing disputes between secular and ecclesiastical authority that limited papal political influence. The legal theory underlying Philip's claim to jurisdiction over Edward's actions as Duke of Gascony drew upon sophisticated interpretations of feudal law that had been developed by French royal lawyers during the previous century. These legal experts argued that feudal relationships created hierarchical obligations that subordinated all ducal actions to royal oversight, regardless of the practical autonomy that dukes might have exercised in their territories. The French position emphasised that Edward's status as King of England could not exempt him from his obligations as a French feudal vassal, creating a fundamental conflict between royal sovereignty and feudal subordination that had no clear legal resolution. Edward's initial diplomatic response to French legal challenges demonstrated his understanding of the broader European political context within which Anglo-French disputes would be resolved. English envoys to continental courts emphasised the historical autonomy of Gascon administration, while also arguing that Philip's claims represented unprecedented expansions of French royal authority that threatened the independence of all European princes who held territories under feudal arrangements with neighbouring kingdoms. This diplomatic strategy sought to create a coalition of European nobles who would oppose French expansion out of concern for their own territorial autonomy. The failure of diplomatic negotiations to resolve the Gascon crisis reflected the fundamental incompatibility between Edward's determination to maintain English control over the duchy and Philip's commitment to establishing effective French royal authority throughout all territories that owed feudal allegiance to the French crown. The legal and political principles at stake in this conflict extended far beyond the immediate territorial questions to encompass broader issues about the nature of feudal relationships and the limits of royal authority that would influence European political development throughout the medieval period. Philip IV's declaration of Gascony's forfeiture in May 1294 represented the culmination of his systematic legal campaign against English territorial holdings in France, while also demonstrating his confidence that French military capabilities could enforce this dramatic expansion of royal authority. The forfeiture decree, proclaimed with elaborate ceremonial emphasis at the French royal court, declared that Edward's violations of his feudal obligations had resulted in the automatic reversion of all his French territories to direct royal control. The legal sophistication of this declaration, supported by detailed documentation of alleged English violations and extensive citations of feudal law precedents, provided Philip with comprehensive justification for military action, while also appealing to European legal opinion that might otherwise have criticised French aggression. The military preparations that accompanied Philip's forfeiture declaration reveal the administrative and logistical capabilities that French royal government had developed during the previous generation of territorial expansion and governmental reform. French forces assembled at strategic locations throughout northern France included not only traditional feudal levies, but also substantial numbers of professional soldiers, siege specialists, and administrative personnel who could implement effective occupation policies in conquered territories. The systematic nature of these military preparations indicated that Philip intended to achieve permanent conquest of English territories rather than merely temporary occupation that might be reversed through subsequent diplomatic negotiations. Edward's response to the Gascon forfeiture required careful coordination between his continental diplomatic initiatives and his domestic preparations for what appeared likely to become a prolonged military conflict with France. The English king's immediate recall of English officials from Gascony and his orders for the fortification of remaining English strongholds in the duchy indicated his recognition that military resistance would be necessary to preserve any English presence in southwestern France. Simultaneously, Edward's diplomatic envoys intensified their efforts to construct anti-French alliances that might provide military support or create diversionary pressures that would limit French capabilities for sustained warfare in Gascony. The Flemish alliance that Edward negotiated during the autumn of 1294 represented his most significant diplomatic achievement in constructing European opposition to French expansion, while also providing England with strategic partners whose commercial and military capabilities could contribute meaningfully to anti-French coalition warfare. The complex political situation in Flanders where Count Guy of Dampierre struggled to maintain autonomy against increasing French royal pressure, created opportunities for English diplomatic intervention that could serve mutual interests in a resisting French hegemony. The Flemish textile industry's dependence upon English wool exports provided economic foundations for political cooperation that transcended the immediate military considerations involved in anti-French alliance construction. The marriage negotiations that accompanied Edward's Flemish alliance demonstrated the sophisticated diplomatic strategies that European rulers employed to strengthen political relationships through dynastic connections that would survive immediate military and political crises. Edward's proposal for the marriage of his daughter Elizabeth to the son of the Count of Flanders created family bonds that would provide long-term foundations for Anglo-Flemish cooperation, while also establishing precedents for future marriage alliances that could expand English influence throughout the Low Countries. These matrimonial arrangements required complex negotiations over dowries, inheritance rights, and political obligations that reflected the multifaceted nature of medieval diplomatic relationships. The German alliances that Edward pursued during this period reflected his understanding that effective resistance to French expansion required coordination among all European powers whose territorial interests might be threatened by French royal ambitions. The fragmented political structure of the Holy Roman Empire provided numerous opportunities for English diplomatic intervention, as individual German princes possessed both the military capabilities and political motivations necessary for participation in anti-French coalitions. Edward's negotiations with Adolf of Nassau, who had recently been elected as Holy Roman Emperor, offered possibilities for high-level coordination of anti-French activities, while also providing English diplomacy with imperial legitimacy that could influence broader European political opinion. The financial arrangements that supported Edward's continental alliance system required unprecedented coordination between English domestic taxation and international diplomatic commitments that strained royal resources while also demonstrating the expanded governmental capabilities that Edward's administrative reforms had created. The subsidies that Edward provided to his continental allies represented substantial proportions of English royal revenues, while the military expeditions necessary to support Allied operations required additional expenditures that exceeded anything previously undertaken by English kings. These financial commitments forced Edward to implement new taxation measures that would generate significant domestic political opposition, while also limiting his resources for other governmental activities. The confirmation of the Charters crisis that emerged during 1297 represented the convergence of Edward's continental military commitments with domestic opposition to the expanded royal authority that his foreign policy required. The systematic taxation that Edward had implemented to fund his anti-French coalition activities generated widespread resistance among English nobles and urban communities who argued that royal financial demands had exceeded all traditional limitations and violated fundamental principles of English constitutional law. The political opposition that coalesced around these taxation issues threatened to undermine Edward's domestic authority while also compromising his ability to maintain the continental alliances that his foreign policy required. The specific grievances that precipitated the confirmation of the Charters crisis included not only Edward's unprecedented taxation levels, but also his military service demands that required English nobles to participate in continental campaigns that served no obvious English interests. The traditional feudal obligations that bound English nobles to provide military service had been designed for defensive warfare or campaigns that would directly benefit English territorial interests, while Edward's continental alliance system required military commitments that appeared to serve primarily French and German political objectives. The resistance that these military demands generated among English nobles reflected broader concerns about the relationship between royal authority and feudal obligations that had been developing throughout Edward's reign. The baronial opposition that emerged during the confirmation of the Charters crisis was led by Roger Bigod, Earl of Norfolk and Marshal of England, whose constitutional position provided him with traditional responsibilities for military organisation that conflicted with Edward's demands for overseas service. Bigod's legal arguments emphasised that feudal military obligations did not extend to foreign campaigns that served no English interests, while also asserting that extraordinary taxation required formal consent from those who would bear the financial burdens. These constitutional positions drew upon English legal traditions, while also reflecting broader European developments in political theory that emphasised contractual relationships between rulers and subjects. The ecclesiastical dimension of the confirmation of the Charters crisis involved conflicts between Edward's financial demands and clerical claims to immunity from royal taxation that had been established through centuries of church-state negotiations. Archbishop Robert Winchelsea of Canterbury emerged as a leading opponent of royal taxation policies, arguing that ecclesiastical revenues could not be diverted to secular purposes without papal authorization, and that clerical participation in warfare violated fundamental principles of canon law. These ecclesiastical objections to Edward's policies created additional political complications, while also connecting English constitutional disputes to broader European conflicts between secular and religious authority. The papal involvement in English taxation disputes reflected the complex relationship between ecclesiastical and secular authority that had been developing throughout medieval Europe as both papal and royal governments expanded their administrative capabilities and territorial ambitions. Pope Boniface VIII's bull Clericis Laicos, promulgated in February 1296, prohibited secular rulers from taxing ecclesiastical revenues without papal consent, while also forbidding clerical cooperation with unauthorized taxation schemes. This papal intervention in English domestic affairs created constitutional crises that required careful negotiation between royal, ecclesiastical and papal authorities to prevent permanent damage to church-state relationships. Edward's response to papal opposition to his taxation policies demonstrated both his determination to maintain royal authority over English governmental affairs and his recognition that ecclesiastical cooperation was essential for effective administration throughout his territories. The king's negotiations with papal representatives involved complex discussions of ecclesiastical privileges, royal prerogatives, and the practical necessities of territorial defence that required compromise solutions satisfying both secular and religious concerns. These negotiations established precedents for church-state relationships that would influence English constitutional development, while also affecting broader European patterns of ecclesiastical-secular cooperation. The resolution of the confirmation of the Charters crisis, through Edward's formal reconfirmation of Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, represented a significant constitutional settlement that acknowledged limitations on royal authority, while also providing mechanisms for royal baronial cooperation in governmental decision-making. The ceremonies that accompanied this constitutional reaffirmation emphasised the contractual nature of the relationship between English kings and their subjects, while also demonstrating Edward's recognition that effective governance required ongoing negotiation rather than simple royal command. These constitutional arrangements established precedents that would influence English political development throughout subsequent centuries, while also providing Edward with the domestic stability necessary for pursuing his continental objectives. The military campaigns that Edward launched in Flanders during 1297 represented his most ambitious attempt to coordinate English military capabilities with continental alliance partners in systematic opposition to French territorial expansion. The English expeditionary force that landed at Sluys included approximately 8,000 infantry and 1,500 heavy cavalry, supported by substantial numbers of Welsh longbowmen whose effectiveness had been demonstrated during Edward's Scottish campaigns. The logistical arrangements for transporting and supplying this substantial military force required unprecedented coordination between English administrative agencies and Flemish commercial networks that demonstrated the expanded governmental capabilities that both kingdoms had developed during the 13th century. The Siege of Lille during the autumn of 1297 provided Edward with opportunities to demonstrate the military engineering capabilities that his castle-building programs had developed, while also testing the effectiveness of Anglo-Flemish military cooperation against French defensive systems. The sophisticated siege techniques that English engineers employed during this campaign included the latest innovations in mechanical artillery and undermining operations that reflected Edward's systematic study of contemporary European military developments. The coordination between English siege specialists and Flemish local forces created tactical combinations that proved effective against French fortifications, while also establishing precedents for future coalition warfare. The diplomatic complications that emerged from Edward's Flemish campaigns reflected the complex web of territorial interests, feudal relationships, and commercial considerations that influenced European international relations during this period. The involvement of English forces in Flemish affairs created legal questions about the extent of Edward's authority to commit English resources to foreign conflicts, while also raising practical concerns about the long-term sustainability of continental military commitments that required ongoing financial and logistical support from England. These diplomatic challenges forced Edward to develop new approaches to international relations that could accommodate the expanded scope of his territorial ambitions, while also maintaining domestic support for his foreign policy initiatives. The truce negotiations that concluded Edward's Flemish military operations in October 1297 provided only temporary respite from the continental conflicts that had consumed English resources and diplomatic attention throughout the mid-1290s. The cessation of hostilities with France, mediated through papal intervention, and the exhaustion of both kingdoms' treasuries, created breathing space for Edward to address the mounting crisis in Scotland that had developed during his absence on the continent. However, the unresolved territorial disputes in Gascony and the fragile nature of the Franco-English settlement ensured that continental obligations would continue to influence Edward's strategic calculations throughout the remainder of his reign. The news of William Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge reached Edward while he was still negotiating the final terms of the Continental Truce, transforming what had appeared to be a manageable Scottish administrative problem into a full-scale military crisis that threatened to undo all the territorial gains achieved through his systematic conquest campaigns of the 1290s. The destruction of English administrative authority throughout Scotland, combined with the elimination of key English officials including Hugh de Cressingham, demonstrated that Scottish resistance possessed both the organisational capabilities and popular support necessary to challenge English rule effectively. The international implications of this Scottish resurgence were particularly troubling, as Wallace's success encouraged French diplomatic initiatives designed to create coordinated pressure against English territorial holdings in both Scotland and Gascony. The return journey from Flanders during the winter of 1297 to 1298 provided Edward with opportunities to reassess his strategic priorities and develop comprehensive plans for addressing the multiple military challenges that now confronted English territorial security. The king's extended consultations with his military advisers during this period revealed the extent to which his continental campaigns had strained English military resources, while also exposing the limitations of traditional feudal service for sustaining prolonged warfare on multiple fronts. The professional military capabilities that Edward had developed during his Welsh conquests would need substantial augmentation to address the simultaneous threats posed by Scottish resistance and potential French intervention in support of Scottish independence. The military preparations that Edward initiated upon his return to England demonstrated both the administrative efficiency that his governmental reforms had created and his recognition that Scottish resistance required more systematic suppression than his previous policies had achieved. The mobilisation orders issued during the spring of 1298 called for the largest English army assembled during the 13th century, reflecting Edward's determination to achieve decisive results that would eliminate Scottish resistance permanently while also deterring French intervention in British affairs. The systematic recruitment of professional soldiers, siege specialists, and logistical personnel indicated that Edward intended to conduct the Scottish campaign according to the highest standards of contemporary military practice, rather than relying solely on traditional feudal levies. The strategic approach that Edward adopted for his return to Scotland reflected the tactical lessons he had absorbed during his continental campaigns, particularly the importance of coordinating different types of military units in mutually supporting formations that could maximise their combined effectiveness. The English army that assembled at York during the summer of 1298 included substantial numbers of Welsh longbowmen whose effectiveness against dense infantry formations had been demonstrated during the Flemish sieges, while Gascon crossbowmen provided mechanical artillery capabilities that could penetrate Scottish defensive arrangements. The integration of these specialised units with traditional English heavy cavalry created tactical combinations that represented significant advances over the military methods employed during Edward's earlier Scottish campaigns. The intelligence networks that Edward's administrators had established throughout Scotland during the period of English occupation provided crucial information about Scottish defensive preparations and the political relationships that sustained Wallace's resistance movement. The systematic collection of information about Scottish strongholds, supply routes and leadership structures enabled English military planners to develop comprehensive strategies that could address the specific challenges posed by Scottish terrain and tactics. The detailed knowledge of Scottish political divisions also created opportunities for diplomatic initiatives that might weaken Scottish resistance through the exploitation of traditional rivalries and competing interests among Scottish noble families. The Battle of Falkirk on July 22, 1298, represented the culmination of Edward's systematic approach to military innovation and his determination to demonstrate English tactical superiority over Scottish resistance forces. The battlefield selected by Wallace for this confrontation reflected his understanding that Scottish forces could not match English military capabilities in open combat, requiring defensive arrangements that would maximise Scottish advantages while minimising English strengths. The rolling terrain south of Falkirk provided natural defensive positions that could anchor Scottish formations, while also offering potential retreat routes if the battle developed unfavourably for Scottish forces. Wallace's tactical deployment at Falkirk demonstrated the military innovations that had emerged from his months of resistance activities and his systematic study of contemporary European military developments. The four large schiltrons that formed the core of Scottish defensive arrangements represented sophisticated adaptations of Swiss and Flemish infantry tactics that had proven effective against cavalry-dominated armies throughout medieval Europe. Each schiltron contained approximately 1,500 spearmen arranged in dense circular formations, surrounded by protective barriers of stakes and ropes that could resist cavalry charges while providing platforms for crossbow and archery fire. The gaps between these formations were occupied by Scottish cavalry units and additional infantry reserves that could respond to tactical developments or exploit opportunities created by English tactical mistakes. The Scottish cavalry that supported Wallace's infantry formations included substantial numbers of nobles and professional soldiers whose equipment and training reflected continental military standards rather than traditional Scottish warfare methods. These mounted units possessed the mobility necessary to harass English formations and disrupt English tactical coordination, while also providing reconnaissance capabilities that could monitor English movements and identify tactical opportunities. The integration of cavalry and infantry elements in Wallace's battle plan demonstrated sophisticated understanding of combined arms tactics that exceeded anything previously achieved by Scottish military commanders. Edward's tactical response to the Scottish defensive arrangements revealed the military innovations that had emerged from his experiences in Wales, Gascony and Flanders, particularly the coordinated use of different types of military units in mutually supporting formations that could address specific tactical challenges. The English battle plan called for systematic archery bombardment of the Scottish schiltrons, followed by coordinated cavalry charges designed to exploit any weaknesses created by missile fire. The preliminary archery phase would be conducted by Welsh longbowmen positioned at maximum effective range, while Gascon crossbowmen provided additional missile fire from protected positions that could maintain continuous pressure on Scottish formations. The English longbowmen who participated in the Falkirk campaign represented the culmination of military developments that had begun during Edward's Welsh Wars and been refined through his continental experiences. These professional archers possessed the training and equipment necessary to deliver sustained volleys of arrows at ranges exceeding 300 yards, while their bodkin point arrows could penetrate most contemporary armour at effective combat distances. The tactical deployment of these archery units in coordinated formations created unprecedented volumes of missile fire that could disrupt enemy formations before they could close to effective combat range, fundamentally altering the tactical balance between offensive and defensive capabilities in medieval warfare. The coordination between English archery and cavalry units at Falkirk demonstrated tactical sophistication that represented significant advances over traditional medieval battle methods. The systematic archery bombardment that opened the English attack created gaps in Scottish schiltron formations that English heavy cavalry could exploit, while the cavalry charges prevented Scottish forces from advancing against the English archers. This tactical integration required extensive training and precise timing that reflected the professional military capabilities Edward had developed through his systematic approach to military reform and innovation. The collapse of Scottish resistance at Falkirk occurred when sustained English archery fire disrupted the schiltron formation sufficiently to allow English cavalry penetration of Scottish defensive lines. The dense masses of Scottish spearmen, initially effective against cavalry charges, became vulnerable to archery attack when confined within their defensive positions and unable to manoeuvre in response to changing tactical conditions. The systematic destruction of individual schiltrons through concentrated archery fire, followed by cavalry assault, eliminated organised Scottish resistance and transformed the battle into a pursuit operation that scattered Scottish forces throughout the surrounding countryside. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Falkirk established military precedents that would influence European warfare throughout the 14th century, particularly the effective combination of longbow archery with heavy cavalry that would characterise English military superiority during the 100 Years' War. The systematic coordination of different military units in mutually supporting formations represented fundamental advances in military organisation that reflected Edward's commitment to professional military development and his systematic study of contemporary European military innovations. The immediate aftermath of Falkirk saw the rapid collapse of organised Scottish resistance throughout the southern counties, as news of the military disaster convinced Scottish nobles and administrative officials that continued opposition to English rule was futile. The systematic pursuit operations that followed the main battle resulted in the capture or elimination of most remaining Scottish military leaders, while the destruction of Scottish supply bases and administrative centres prevented any immediate reorganisation of resistance activities. The comprehensive nature of English victory appeared to vindicate Edward's systematic approach to territorial conquest and military innovation. However, the apparent completeness of English success at Falkirk concealed fundamental problems that would eventually undermine Edward's Scottish policy and create opportunities for renewed resistance under different leadership and organisational structures. Wallace's escape from the battlefield, along with other key resistance leaders, preserved the nucleus of Scottish opposition while also maintaining the symbolic leadership that could inspire future resistance movements. The harsh treatment of Scottish civilian populations during the post-battle occupation created additional grievances that would fuel ongoing opposition to English rule, while the systematic destruction of Scottish political and administrative structures eliminated potential collaborators who might have facilitated peaceful English governance. The administrative arrangements that Edward established for governing Scotland following his Falkirk victory reflected his determination to prevent any recurrence of organised resistance through the systematic elimination of Scottish political autonomy and cultural identity. The appointment of English officials to all significant administrative positions throughout Scotland ensured that Scottish governmental structures would serve English rather than Scottish interests, while the imposition of English legal procedures and administrative practices eliminated traditional Scottish institutions that might serve as focal points for future resistance movements. The castle-building programme that Edward initiated throughout Scotland following Falkirk represented his understanding that permanent conquest required sustained military presence, backed by sophisticated fortification systems that could maintain English control even during periods of reduced military activity. The strategic placement of new English castles at key locations throughout Scotland created an integrated defensive network that could coordinate resistance to any future Scottish uprising, while also providing secure bases for English administrative activities and commercial operations. The economic policies that accompanied Edward's post-Falkirk occupation of Scotland demonstrated his systematic approach to territorial integration and his recognition that effective conquest required the subordination of Scottish economic resources to English commercial and financial interests. The establishment of English-controlled markets, the imposition of English commercial regulations, and the systematic extraction of Scottish agricultural and mineral resources created economic structures that reinforced political control while generating substantial revenues for Edward's treasury. The period of apparent English success in Scotland following Falkirk proved to be temporary, as the harsh nature of English occupation policies and the systematic suppression of Scottish cultural and political identity created conditions for renewed resistance under different leadership and organisational structures. The emergence of Robert Bruce as a claimant to the Scottish throne in 1306 would transform Scottish resistance from the popular uprising that Wallace had led into a systematic campaign for royal legitimacy that would prove far more difficult for English forces to suppress. The coronation of Robert Bruce at Scone on March 25, 1306, represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of Scottish resistance that created new challenges for Edward's Scottish policy and demonstrated the limitations of purely military approaches to territorial conquest. Bruce's claim to royal authority, based on his family's genealogical connections to the Scottish royal house and his participation in the Great Cause arbitration proceedings, provided Scottish resistance with legal legitimacy that Wallace's popular uprising had lacked. The ceremonial aspects of Bruce's coronation, conducted according to traditional Scottish royal rituals despite English control over most Scottish territory, created powerful symbolic foundations for renewed resistance that could appeal to Scottish national sentiment and international diplomatic support. The political circumstances surrounding Bruce's coronation revealed the complex web of personal ambitions, family loyalties and strategic calculations that influenced Scottish noble responses to English occupation. Bruce's decision to claim the throne represented a calculated gamble based on his assessment that English control over Scotland remained fundamentally unstable despite Edward's military victories and administrative reforms. The support that Bruce received from key Scottish nobles, including members of his own family and traditional allies, indicated that significant portions of the Scottish political establishment remained committed to independence despite the apparent hopelessness of military resistance against English forces. The murder of John Comyn at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries on February 10, 1306, which preceded Bruce's coronation by several weeks, demonstrated both the ruthless determination that Bruce brought to his pursuit of royal authority and the violent factional conflicts that characterised Scottish politics during this period. The elimination of Comyn, who represented the primary alternative claimant to Scottish royal authority and had been cooperating with English occupation forces, removed Bruce's most dangerous rival while also committing him irrevocably to armed resistance against English rule. The sacrilegious nature of this killing, committed within a consecrated church, created additional complications for Bruce's claim to legitimate royal authority, while also demonstrating his willingness to violate traditional moral constraints in pursuit of political objectives. Edward's response to Bruce's coronation and the renewal of Scottish resistance revealed both his personal fury at this unexpected challenge to his territorial achievements and his recognition that Scottish opposition now possessed political legitimacy and organisational capabilities that previous resistance movements had lacked. The English king's immediate mobilisation of military forces for a new Scottish campaign demonstrated his determination to eliminate Bruce's challenge through overwhelming force, while his diplomatic initiatives sought to isolate Scottish resistance from potential international support that might sustain prolonged opposition to English rule. The military preparations that Edward initiated during the spring and summer of 1306 reflected both his understanding of the enhanced challenges that Bruce's royal claim created in his declining physical capabilities that limited his personal participation in active campaigning. The English forces assembled for the new Scottish campaign included substantial numbers of experienced veterans from Edward's previous military operations, while the appointment of younger commanders to key positions acknowledged the king's recognition that sustained warfare might require leadership capabilities that his advancing age could no longer provide. The guerrilla warfare tactics that Bruce employed during the early phases of his resistance campaign demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the strategic and tactical limitations that constrained English military capabilities in Scottish terrain. Rather than attempting to confront English forces in conventional battles, where English advantages in equipment, training and organisation would prove decisive, Bruce focused on harassment operations, supply line disruption, and the systematic elimination of English administrative personnel throughout Scotland. These tactics required extensive local support networks and detailed knowledge of Scottish geographical conditions that English occupation forces could not easily counter through conventional military operations. The gradual expansion of Bruce's territorial control during 1306 and early 1307 revealed both the effectiveness of his guerrilla warfare strategy and the fundamental weaknesses of English occupation policies that had alienated Scottish populations and created widespread support for resistance activities. The systematic attacks on English castles and administrative centres throughout Scotland demonstrated that Bruce possessed both the military capabilities and popular support necessary to challenge English rule effectively, while the international recognition that his royal claim began receiving indicated that European diplomatic opinion was shifting in favour of Scottish independence. Edward's final preparations for his last Scottish campaign, during the winter of 1306 to 1307, reflected his recognition that Bruce's challenge represented the most serious threat to English territorial security that had emerged during his reign. The ageing king's determination to lead this campaign personally, despite his obvious physical decline and the advice of his medical attendants, demonstrated both his personal commitment to Scottish conquest and his understanding that only decisive military action could preserve the territorial achievements that had defined his reign. The systematic mobilisation of English military resources for this final campaign represented Edward's last attempt to achieve the complete conquest of Scotland that had eluded him throughout nearly 2 decades of intermittent warfare. The systematic mobilisation of English military resources for Edward's final Scottish campaign during the winter of 1306 to 1307 would prove to be the last great undertaking of a reign that had fundamentally transformed both England and the broader British Isles. Yet even as the ageing king prepared for what he hoped would be the decisive conquest of Scotland, the institutional and legal frameworks he had created were already demonstrating their capacity to outlast their creator and shape the development of English governance for centuries to come. The administrative revolution that Edward had implemented during his 35-year reign represented the most comprehensive transformation of English governmental structures since the Norman conquest. The systematic surveys, legal reforms, and bureaucratic innovations that had emerged from his early quo warranto proceedings had created governmental capabilities that far exceeded anything available to his predecessors. The Royal Chancery now operated according to standardised procedures that could process thousands of documents annually, while the Exchequer had developed sophisticated accounting methods that provided detailed oversight of royal revenues and expenditures throughout the realm. These administrative innovations had transformed medieval English government from a largely personal institution dependent upon royal presence into a bureaucratic system capable of functioning effectively even during extended royal absences. The legal legacy of Edward's reign proved even more enduring than his administrative achievements, as the statutory reforms he had implemented established fundamental principles that would govern English law throughout the medieval period and beyond. The Statute of Westminster had created comprehensive legal frameworks for resolving property disputes, while the Statute of Westminster II had established the legal foundations for entailed estates that would influence English land law for centuries. The systematic codification of legal procedures that had emerged from Edward's judicial reforms provided English courts with standardised methods for conducting trials, evaluating evidence, and reaching judgments that ensured consistent application of royal justice throughout the realm. The development of common law during Edward's reign represented perhaps his most significant contribution to English constitutional development, as the systematic integration of local customs with royal legal principles created a unified legal system that could accommodate the diverse conditions found throughout England, while maintaining consistent standards of justice. The professional judiciary that Edward had created possessed the legal training and administrative experience necessary to apply these common law principles effectively, while the standardised court procedures ensured that legal decisions would be based upon established precedents rather than arbitrary personal judgments. This legal framework provided the foundation for the sophisticated jurisprudence that would characterise English law throughout subsequent centuries. The parliamentary institutions that had emerged from Edward's financial crises established constitutional precedents that fundamentally altered the relationship between English kings and their subjects. The principle that extraordinary taxation required parliamentary consent had evolved from practical political necessity into a constitutional requirement that would constrain royal authority throughout the medieval period and beyond. The model Parliament of 1295 had demonstrated that representative assemblies could enhance governmental effectiveness, while also protecting subject rights, creating institutional mechanisms that would influence English political development for centuries. The procedural innovations that Edward had introduced during parliamentary sessions provided frameworks for orderly debate and decision-making that would govern parliamentary operations long after his death. Edward's military innovations had revolutionised medieval warfare through the systematic integration of different types of combat units in coordinated tactical formations that maximised their combined effectiveness. The longbow tactics that had been perfected during his Welsh and Scottish campaigns would dominate European battlefields throughout the 14th century, while the combined arms strategies he had developed provided tactical frameworks that would influence military thinking for generations. The professional military capabilities that Edward had created through systematic recruitment, training, and logistical support represented fundamental advances in military organisation that established England as the premier military power in medieval Europe. The castle-building programmes that Edward had implemented throughout Wales and Scotland created architectural innovations that influenced European military engineering for centuries. Master James of St. George and the other military engineers who had served Edward had developed concentric defensive systems that represented the pinnacle of medieval fortification design, while the systematic integration of residential, administrative, and military functions within these castles created new models for governmental architecture. The strategic placement of these fortifications had created integrated defensive networks that could coordinate their resistance to enemy attacks while maintaining secure communications with supporting territories. The iron ring of castles that Edward had constructed in Wales demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the geographical and political factors that determine the effectiveness of military occupation. Caernarfon Castle, with its distinctive polygonal towers and elaborate decorative stonework, had been designed not merely as a military stronghold, but as a symbol of English royal authority that could overawe potential Welsh resistance through its architectural grandeur. Conwy Castle's massive round towers and comprehensive defensive arrangements had created an impregnable fortress that could maintain English control over the crucial Conwy Valley even during periods of widespread Welsh unrest. Harlech Castle's commanding position on its rocky outcrop had provided English forces with observation capabilities that could monitor Welsh movements throughout central Wales, while also serving as a secure base for offensive operations. The economic transformation that Edward's policies had created throughout his territories demonstrated his understanding that effective conquest required the systematic integration of conquered populations into broader commercial and administrative networks. The new towns that he'd established in Wales and other frontier regions had created English commercial centres that could serve as focal points for cultural assimilation, while also generating substantial revenues for the royal treasury. The standardisation of weights, measures and currency that Edward had implemented had facilitated commercial development throughout England, while also strengthening royal control over economic activities. The creation of English national identity during Edward's reign represented one of his most complex and controversial achievements, as his systematic conquest and integration of Celtic territories had established England as the dominant power within the British Isles, while also creating lasting resentments that would influence British politics for centuries. The systematic suppression of Welsh political autonomy and cultural traditions had eliminated the independent Welsh principalities that had existed since the Roman withdrawal, creating a unified English state that encompassed virtually all of lowland Britain. However, this political unification had been achieved through military conquest and cultural suppression that generated enduring hostilities among Celtic populations. The legal and administrative integration of Wales into the English governmental system had created institutional frameworks that would govern Anglo-Welsh relations throughout the medieval period. The Statute of Rhuddlan had established English legal procedures throughout Wales, while preserving certain Welsh customs in matters of inheritance and property rights, creating hybrid legal systems that acknowledged Welsh cultural distinctiveness while maintaining English political control. The appointment of English officials to key administrative positions throughout Wales had ensured that Welsh governmental structures would serve English rather than Welsh interests, while the systematic exclusion of Welsh populations from positions of authority had created lasting grievances that would periodically erupt into violent resistance. The Scottish dimension of Edward's territorial ambitions had proven far more problematic than his Welsh conquests, as the sophisticated political culture and international connections of medieval Scotland had provided resources for sustained resistance that Welsh principalities had lacked. The legal complexities surrounding Edward's claim to overlordship over Scotland had created constitutional questions that could not be resolved through military conquest alone, while the geographical challenges of governing Scotland from England had proven insurmountable despite Edward's administrative innovations and military capabilities. The Great Cause arbitration had demonstrated Edward's sophisticated understanding of legal procedures and genealogical evidence, while also providing him with opportunities to establish precedents for English overlordship that would influence Anglo-Scottish relations for generations. However, the practical implementation of this overlordship had generated resistance that revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Scottish expectations of independence and English demands for subordination. The systematic destruction of Scottish political institutions and cultural symbols that had accompanied Edward's military victories had created grievances that would sustain Scottish resistance long after his death. The international implications of Edward's territorial expansion had established England as a major European power whose policies could influence continental political developments, while also creating obligations that would constrain English foreign policy throughout subsequent centuries. The Gascon inheritance that Edward had defended against French expansion had provided England with valuable commercial revenues and strategic depth in southwestern Europe, while also creating feudal obligations that would periodically bring England into conflict with French royal ambitions. The diplomatic alliances that Edward had constructed with Flemish and German princes had demonstrated English capabilities for coalition warfare, while also establishing precedents for English intervention in continental European affairs. The constitutional crises that had emerged from Edward's military and diplomatic commitments had forced fundamental reconsiderations of the relationship between royal authority and subject consent that would influence English political development throughout the medieval period and beyond. The confirmation of the charters had established principles of limited royal authority and subject rights that would constrain English kings while also providing mechanisms for peaceful resolution of constitutional disputes. The parliamentary institutions that had emerged from these crises had created representative frameworks that would eventually evolve into the sophisticated constitutional system that would characterise early modern England. Edward's personal reputation among contemporary chroniclers reflected the complex and often contradictory nature of his achievements, as his undeniable successes in military conquest and governmental reform were balanced against the brutal methods he had employed and the lasting resentments his policies had created. The monastic chroniclers who documented his reign praised his legal reforms and administrative efficiency, while also recording the systematic violence that had characterized his conquest campaigns. The secular writers who celebrated his military victories also acknowledged the harsh treatment of conquered populations that had accompanied these successes. The nickname Longshanks that contemporaries applied to Edward reflected both his impressive physical stature and his reputation for relentless pursuit of his territorial and political objectives. Standing approximately 6 feet 2 inches tall in an age when most men barely exceeded 5.5 feet, Edward's commanding physical presence had reinforced his political authority, while also contributing to the intimidating reputation that had facilitated his diplomatic and military successes. His distinctive appearance, with his long limbs, drooping left eyelid, and greying hair, had become familiar throughout Europe as a symbol of English royal power and determination. The administrative records that documented Edward's daily activities revealed the systematic approach he had brought to royal governance, and his personal involvement in the detailed implementation of his policy initiatives. The household accounts showed his careful attention to financial management and his systematic efforts to maximise royal revenues through efficient administration and innovative taxation methods. The diplomatic correspondence demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of European political relationships and his skillful manipulation of international alliances to serve English interests. Modern historical assessment of Edward's reign has emphasised both his remarkable achievements in governmental innovation and territorial expansion and the problematic methods he employed to achieve these successes. Contemporary historians have recognised his contributions to English legal development and constitutional progress, while also acknowledging the systematic violence and cultural suppression that characterised his conquest policies. The institutional frameworks that Edward created have been praised for their sophistication and durability, while his treatment of conquered populations has been criticised for its brutality and cultural insensitivity. The long-term consequences of Edward's policies have influenced British political development throughout subsequent centuries, as the constitutional precedents he established provided foundations for the gradual evolution of parliamentary government and limited royal authority. The legal innovations of his reign contributed to the development of sophisticated jurisprudence that would influence common law systems throughout the English-speaking world. However, the territorial conquest that he achieved also created lasting tensions within the British Isles that would periodically erupt into violent conflicts throughout subsequent centuries. The death of Edward I on July 7th, 1307, at Berg by Sands while leading his final campaign against Robert Bruce marked the end of one of the most transformative reigns in English history. The ageing king's determination to continue campaigning despite his obvious physical decline demonstrated the relentless energy that had characterised his entire reign, while his death during active military service symbolised the warrior kingship that had defined medieval English royal authority. His final instructions to his son regarding the continuation of the Scottish campaign reflected his unwavering commitment to the territorial expansion that had consumed the latter decades of his reign. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed both the strength of the institutional frameworks he had created and the personal nature of the authority that had held his territorial empire together. The smooth transition to Edward II's rule demonstrated that English governmental structures could function effectively during royal transitions, while the rapid deterioration of English positions in Scotland showed that Edward's personal leadership had been crucial for maintaining English territorial control. The parliamentary institutions, legal frameworks, and administrative systems that Edward had established would continue to govern England throughout subsequent centuries, representing his most enduring contribution to English constitutional development. The legacy of Edward thus encompasses both remarkable achievements in governmental innovation and territorial expansion, and the problematic consequences of the methods he employed to achieve these successes. His transformation of English legal, administrative, and military institutions established foundations for England's emergence as a major European power, while his conquest policies created lasting tensions within the British Isles that would influence political development for centuries. The constitutional precedents he established would eventually contribute to the development of limited monarchy and parliamentary government, while the territorial ambitions he pursued would shape English foreign policy throughout the medieval period and beyond. Edward Longshanks had forged a new model of English kingship that combined systematic governmental innovation with relentless territorial expansion, creating both the institutional foundations for England's future greatness and the enduring conflicts that would define British politics for generations to come.